The young lady looked closely at her sister and with a joyful smile asked her to open her eyes. The girl, yawning, looked at her sister in bewilderment as she did not expect to see her early in the morning. On the day she turned 16, her sister said she had prepared something special for her as a gift. It turned out that she prepared the main character in broad daylight. She was shocked and asked her sister if she had really just brought someone else's child into the house. Diana, looking at her sister, said that this was her new friend. Amy screamed at her sister that she had kidnapped someone else's child and that the parents could look for him. Diana sighed heavily and said that she had not kidnapped the little boy. She reported that she found the young man alone in the forest, unconscious. She looked at the young man with a tender smile and said that he didn't remember anything at all. She looked at her sister and asked with a smile why they didn't take care of him until they found his parents. Diana smiled and told her sister to say hello to the baby, as he would be living in their house. If her guess is correct, then this is a scene from a romance novel she read in a past life. She knew that this child was actually an adult, the main character, and that a curse had been placed on him. It turned him into a child, a curse that was only common to members of the Imperial family who possessed magic. He was the son of Archduke Rheinicus of Iberia. Amy was in shock, wondering how much he wanted to escape from the duchy that he fell into the hands of her sister. She looked closely at the young man and asked what he thought about the name Nox. She said that her sister found him at night in the forest and his name meant night. Diana looked at the young man with a joyful smile and said that it was a very good name. She looked at him intently and asked what he thought about it. The young man bowed his head in embarrassment because he did not know what to answer. Diana said with a happy smile that she liked the name, and that was how she would call him from now on. Diana looked at her sister and said with a smile that she had prepared food, so they should go to the table. A moment later she left, leaving the young people alone. Amy sighed heavily and looked intently at the young man. In the novel, her sister Diana gave a name to a boy who had lost his memory. Someone gave him a name for the first time, a man who grew up in cruelty and misunderstanding. She fell deeply in love with him after the prince's men killed her. The young man's memory returned, and he was determined to take revenge. The young lady knew she had made a mistake when she gave him the name, but she knew it was the only way to save her sister. Even if she thought everything was going as usual after she picked up the main character, something changed in her. But everything looked as if it was meant to be. Amy understood that if she was a minor character, it was all real. So this boy who was in front of her is really the main character. She knew she had to escape before the prince sent his hounds after her. 10 years ago, the sisters were having fun and playing around carefree. Amy looked at her sister sharply and told her to be quiet in the living room. Diana looked at her sister happily and said that she knew about it. She was just very happy when she saw her sister. Amy asked her sister if she should be at the palace today. Diana said that she was not officially a knight, yet it would be wrong if the daughter of the head of the knights would constantly visit the palace. Diana, barely holding back her laughter, looked at her sister as she had already read the Duke's series of books. Amy asked about necklaces that use mana for teleportation and also what about flying carriages. Diana smiled and said that there were regular carriages, but she didn't know what flying ones were for. She understood that this place was radically different from the one where she lived in her past life. A moment later, Diana said with a smile that she would have to tell this brilliant idea, Professor. A moment later, a man burst into their room and announced that a siege had begun from the knights of the Imperial Palace, and they needed to leave. She was furious, and because everything clearly reminded her of a novel she had read in a past life. At the same time, Diana, with a joyful smile, told the children to start eating. Amy looked closely at her sister, who was simply fluttering with happiness. Everything was exactly like in the novel of her life. The little boy is actually the leader of the empire, and he had a very tragic fate. His parents were happily married, but one day the pregnant duchess was kidnapped by a barbarian. After her rescue, the Duke doubted his wife's fidelity and began to cheat on her. The Duchess, speechless because of her husband's infidelity, climbed into the tower. Knox grew up alone without the love of his parents. One day he killed the precious bird in the Duke's house. He said that the bird was too noisy, so he killed it. It was at that moment that the violence began from the angry Duke. The boy did not know what love was and never received it. He grew up surrounded by cruelty, and when he killed his father and became Grand Duke, he was only 17 years old. After that, he reached many heights, his elder cousin another male character. The Crown Prince began to watch him. The curse of the family which turned him into a child during the day and returned him to his former form at night was dangerous to reveal. When the prince learned of this, he lured the duke into the palace under the pretext of helping the duke left with no choice headed to the palace. From the very beginning, the prince had no intention of helping the young man. Instead, he sent a hired killer. He fought until the morning, taking the form of a child, but still managed to hide in the forest. But the next morning, the girl found him. Diana gently reached out to the young man, but he pushed her away. She looked at him intently, and he flinched. The boy hid behind the young lady and said that he didn't like Diana. Knox told Diana not to get close to him. Diana smiled and said that she really liked him. Amy looked at the boy intently and said that he was wrong because he should not have talked to the person who offered him food. She looked at him intently and asked him not to do that again. He sighed heavily and nodded in agreement. Amy smiled at the young boy and told him to sit down and eat. Diana looked at them with a joyful smile as they behaved very sweetly. Moments later, Amy began feeding the young man. Diana froze for a moment, and after a few seconds she shouted that it was very sweet. Diana screamed about her sister that the boy seemed to think of her as his mother. Amy was in shock but knew she had to feed him. She knew that it would be very good if the novel was about the love between the older sister and the main character. But in the novel, after her sister died at the behest of the prince, Knox met the main character and took revenge on the prince, and later began to live happily with her. Amy understood that it was impossible to say with certainty that everything would happen exactly like this. She hoped that it was just a coincidence, and that it was an accident. Sometime later, the young lady checked whether her sister was sleeping or not. She quietly crept out of the room and abruptly closed the door. Her sister always kept a close eye on her and told her several times not to wander around at night, so today she slipped some alcohol into her sister's food. She was very ashamed and she couldn't even imagine how she could do something like that, but she had no other choice. Amy wanted to make sure if it was true that she was living in a novel or if it was all her imagination. She slowly walked into the room where the little boy was, but she froze in shock when she saw a young, attractive guy. Amy froze in embarrassment because she knew that such a question, but it couldn't be. She remembered the scripture of the novel and froze in shock because she did not understand why such a dry description was for such a handsome man. She clearly saw his beautiful, long and thick eyelashes. She didn't know that he was so beautiful. But now that she was sure of Tom, she had no reason to look at him. She turned around to leave, but suddenly the young man grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. He looked at her intently and asked who she was. Amy froze in place from the slag. Taken aback, she tremblingly said that she was the landlady. He looked at her in bewilderment. But a moment later she said that since she had answered his question, he should get off her. For some time they sat and looked at each other. He looked at her with fury and asked if she had really dragged him into the house. She hesitated and didn't know what to answer. She understood that if he had woken up at night before he would have made a noise, but it was quiet at night, which meant it was the first time. He sighed heavily, and the young lady in turn asked if he really didn't remember anything. She said that he was fast asleep, so she decided to check on him, but found that he was unconscious in the forest. He looked at her intently, asked where they were now. He asked her for details, but she could not answer a single one. A moment later she said that everything seemed confusing now, but if he rested they would talk next time, calling his name. He looked at her intently and said that she should not lie to him since he did not remember anything, but he knew that it was not his name. Amy said that it was she who called him that. He looked at her in bewilderment because he thought it was complete nonsense. She sighed heavily and said that he looked like a little child all day long. He couldn't believe it. Amy said that when he was a child he would run after her like a little tail, eat rice and eat tomatoes with a fork. She sighed heavily and looking at the young man said that he should understand her. The young lady was puzzled and wanted someone to help her, but he couldn't take it anymore and angrily hit the wall behind her. She was in shock. He looked at her intently and said that he had to check everything personally. She was taken aback as she did not understand what he was going to check. He said he wanted to check if he really was turning into a child. He looked at her intently, moving closer, and said that if she was sure of her words, then she should stay alone until the morning. He looked at her closely and said that he wanted to make sure that she was not lying to him. Looking at the young lady, he said that he needed proof and nothing more. He sighed heavily and said coldly that morning would come soon. She was in shock because she understood that her sister would wake up soon. She said she needed to go back to her room, but he sat her down and asked where she was going. He looked at her with a smirk and asked if he hadn't told her that she wouldn't go anywhere until she got proof. It was in shock, as it had been caught in an unsuccessful escape. He sat down next to the young lady and said that it would be better for her not to think about running away. She was embarrassed, so she timidly asked if he could move away from her a little. He looked at her irritably and asked if it was she who had said earlier that when he was a child, they were always together. He looked at her intently and asked if she had turned away because she was ashamed to look him in the eyes. A moment later, she told him her name and he thought about it as she led him into the house. Amy said with a smile that she took good care of him. After a few seconds, she apologized because she had talked a lot. The young man sighed heavily but did not answer her. A moment later, he leaned on her shoulder. She froze for a moment and flinched. A few seconds later, the young lady called him in alarm. She was shocked because he had suddenly fallen asleep. He looked at her intently and asked where she was going. Amy screamed and asked if he hadn't been sleeping. In the morning, Diana called everyone to the table. With a smile, she told her sister that they had caught her in bed, but it seemed that she really liked the young man. Amy was distracted, did not understand what sister was talking about. Diana smiled and asked her sister if she really snuck into the room to sleep with the boy. Diana smiled and said that she was actually worried that he would sleep alone, but she was glad that sister kept an eye on him. She smiled and told her sister that they would sleep together today. Amy was shocked. Diana smiled and told her sister that she didn't need to be embarrassed, and also invited her to breakfast. Amy was puzzled because everything was not like that. After some events, dangerous cohabitation began, but a problem arose. A few days ago, a young man began to follow a young lady. She walked and slowly went about her business, but at the same time he followed her. Amy was puzzled because she didn't understand why he kept following her. She looked intently at the young man and told him not to follow her around, but rather to sit down and rest. He looked at her with tears in his eyes and told her not to leave. Amy was taken aback and worried, asked if something was wrong. He cried and said that it was his fault and also asked for forgiveness. The young lady knew that her sister would grumble if she noticed the boy crying. She was puzzled because her life had ultimately changed. So sometime later, she taught the boy to read. She looked intently at the young man as she saw that he had read everything she had told him. After a long read, she looked at him in surprise. Amy told the boy that both words had the same pronunciation, but her name had nothing to do with the stars. Diana smiled and said that her sister's name meant beloved child. Diana said with a smile that her parents worked for a long time for her sister to be born. Amy sighed and told her sister to leave. Diana hugged her sister with a joyful smile and said that she wanted everyone to know that she was their favorite. A moment later, Diana looked at the boy with a smile and told him to hug her tighter. Amy looked closely at her sister because she didn't suspect anything, but now she was in great danger. The innocent baby turned into a daring young man at night. He looked at her closely and asked why she sat so far away and asked her to move closer. Knox looked at her sharply and told her not to make him repeat himself several times. She shuddered but still agreed to do as he ordered. A moment later, the young lady looked at him intently and spoke timidly. She asked if he wanted to get dressed first, and then they could talk. He sighed heavily and said that she still didn't have any clothes for him. She was taken aback and said that everything was correct. She was shocked because she couldn't look at him calmly. It was difficult for her to concentrate because in this form he was very handsome. He looked at her coldly and said that in that case she should close her eyes. She said that she didn't want to do that. Knox sighed heavily and said that he had been watching her for several days and thought she was telling the truth. He said that she should tell him if she knew anything about him. Amy said that she had already told him everything. He couldn't understand her motives and asked why she had dragged him into the house, and he was also interested in his behavior during the day. She said she just found him in the woods and brought him into the house, and her sister said he miraculously survived there alone. He asked in surprise if she really didn't live alone. Amy said with a smile that she lived with her sister. He said that she should tell everything in great detail. Amy said with a smile that during the day he behaves like a normal child. She said that he loved to follow her around. She washed him in the mornings and fed him with her spoons. And he was also a slob, and rice was always stuck to his cheeks, and she would wipe his face. Amy said with a smile that she was proud of how well he had started reading recently. When his mood improved, he began to sing funny songs. He looked at her coldly and did not answer. She smiled and said that he was not often in a good mood. It seemed to her that she had relaxed and said too much. Amy said that when she found him, he had one scratch on him, and most likely he got caught on some branch. He asked if she knew why he was transforming. Amy said she wasn't sure, and it was probably some kind of curse. He looked at her in surprise as he didn't know that magic existed. She said that it was something like magic, but not magic itself. She said that unfortunately she had never seen magic before. A moment later, the young lady heard her sister calling her and was taken aback but answered her. Diana asked her sister with a smile if she was asleep. Standing outside the door, she asked her sister if she was disturbing the young man there. Amy said that she had just finished reading him a story and he had fallen asleep. Amy gestured to the young man to be quiet, but at the same time told her sister to be quiet. Diana said she just thought she heard the conversation, but she still asked her sister to go to bed. A moment later, the young man looked at her menacingly and asked what it was. She was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. Amy said that she wanted to keep his transformation a secret. He was surprised and didn't understand why. Amy said that if sister found out about this, she would kick him out, and when he was an adult, it was not difficult for him to survive, but during the day he turned into a child, and this is dangerous. He asked in surprise if she really wanted him to support her lie. She sighed heavily and said that it was so. Knox sighed heavily and said that he couldn't refuse such an offer, but he still asked if she could handle it. She looked at him in bewilderment, but he said that she would have to share a room with him. The young lady was embarrassed. She asked why he didn't sleep in the closet while sister slept. Knox asked if she knew when sister slept. Diana looked at her sister closely and asked if something had happened. Amy said that nothing had happened and that she was perfectly fine. Diana asked her sister in bewilderment why she was holding the book upside down. The lady was shocked. She said sheepishly that she had accidentally turned it over and that it happens to everyone. A moment later, Diana said that she went to an abandoned house and picked some medicinal herbs there, but there she saw a magic formula today. Knox looked closely at the young lady and said that she looked tired, so she should rest. Looking at the girl, he asked if she had any pain anywhere. She smiled and said that it was not so. He sighed heavily and said that she should let him know if she felt unwell, because he was used to pain so he couldn't watch it suffer. She asked in surprise what it meant that he was used to pain. He said that he didn't know, but he was just used to it. She looked at him taken aback because she didn't know what to say. She hugged them with a smile and told the young man that he would not be in pain anymore because they were all together now and would live happily. Diana looked intently at the young people and said that they would always be happy. Amy smiled and said that it would be so, but she in turn was puzzled, since the child did not remember anything about himself, but said that he had become accustomed to pain. She understood that his ordeal never ended. Knox asked the young lady if they had any books on magic. She said that of course they didn't because they were very expensive. He sighed heavily and said that he would like to look up something about his curse. She asked in surprise if he really thought it was a curse. He said that he assumed it was. Knox said that, as she had said earlier, everything that happened to him could only be explained by magic. She knew that the curse would break when he met the main character, but she didn't understand what to do now. She remembered how sister told her about an abandoned house on the outskirts because that was where she saw the magical seals. A moment later, the young lady screamed. He was taken aback as he had not expected her to stand up so abruptly. She ran up to him and said with a joyful smile that she might know where to get books about magic. Amy asked with a happy smile if he would thank her if she got them. The young man was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, but a moment later he said that of course he would thank her. As she was leaving, Diana told her sister that she had told her everything about the abandoned house, as there were magical inscriptions there and also several books. Amy asked her sister if it wasn't dangerous there. The young lady sighed heavily and said that of course it was dangerous there, and one could meet monsters along the way, but the main thing was not to turn off the path. Diana looked at her sister closely and said she didn't know why she was so interested in the house. She told her sister that she still shouldn't go there alone. Diana asked her sister to stay home even if she was very curious because she would not be able to survive if something happened to her. Amy sighed heavily and told her sister that she was just asking her sister not to worry. Looking at the time, Diana said that it was time for her to go, and she would be gone for a few days because the monsters had been really wild this year. Diana sighed heavily and said that she could already imagine how they would grieve without her. She hugged the young man with a joyful smile and told him not to worry because she would be back soon. As she left, she said with a joyful smile that she would be back soon. A moment later, the young lady looked at her companion and said that they could go read. They sat quietly for a while and read books. Knox froze for a moment when he read the word house. Amy explained every word to him with a smile. She looked at him closely and said that she thought he used to live in a big house because he looked like a nobleman. She said with a smile that he was a very handsome and quite smart boy, and that in the future he should become an influential person. She smiled and said that one day he would return to his real home where his family was waiting for him. A moment later, the young man shouted that he didn't want this. In a fit of anger, he accidentally dropped the plate of cookies and it broke. The young lady screamed and called him. She was shocked because he was hurt, but he said that he was not in pain. Sometime later, she treated him early. Amy looked at the boy and told him not to lie, as she knew it was hurting him. Amy asked him to stop keeping everything inside. Amy looked at him with concern and asked if she would be hurt, and if he would feel sorry for her. She said that sometimes people tend to worry about their relatives, to worry about a loved one when he is having a hard time, when he is lonely and sad. She understood that these feelings are alien to him. There was no one next to him to explain such simple truths to him, so his gaze was empty. She looked at him closely and wondered how much pain he had been through. Amy looked at the boy and told him to listen to her. She said that if it hurts him, then it hurts her too. As she left, she said that he shouldn't worry, as she would quickly clean everything up. Knox looked after the young lady with surprise and intentness. She came back into the room and told him not to take off the bandage. She said that she would straighten his bandage right away. Coming closer to him, she asked him to give her his hand, but he pulled his hand away and said that she did not need to do that. He looked away from her and said that it didn't hurt. Amy looked at him with fury because she understood that whether he was a child or an adult in both cases, he was an insufferable, stubborn person. She said that even if it was just a scratch, if it wasn't treated, it could become much more serious. She said that it was better to take care of everything in advance so that there would be no problems later. Amy said with a smile that she knew where the books about magic were, but she didn't think they would say anything about his curse. He asked in surprise if she really wanted to take him out of the room. She smiled and said that it was just like that because her sister would be gone for a few days. She said with a smile that she thought he was bored sitting in the room, so she wanted to show him the house. A moment later, she left the room with him and began the little excursion. Amy told him about all the rooms with a joyful smile. She smiled and said that if he went outside, he would see a shed where they kept weapons and other things for care. She also showed him the garden and told him that her sister was looking after the plants. He looked at her intently and said that her sister must be very strong since she was not afraid to go into the forest alone. Amy smiled and said that her sister was destined to become a great knight, so she was good at dealing with monsters. The young lady suddenly remembered that sister had once found a sword in the forest, but said that it would not suit her because it was too big. She asked the young man if he would like to look at it because the sword might suit him. Knox said he didn't remember wielding the sword. Amy said maybe his body remembered how to use it. The young man looked intently at the beautiful sword. A moment later, he swung his sword and cut through the air. Amy said in surprise that he was doing quite well. He sighed heavily and said that he still didn't remember anything. She knew that hope was the last to die. She said the sword had been lying in the barn for a long time, so she asked if he could use it. The young lady in turn looked closely at the sword and touched it but accidentally cut herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it wasn't just a scratch. She was in shock and screamed that the scratch hurt a lot, and since she was a living person, it hurt her. Knox looked at her with confusion and asked why she was looking at him like that. She said that he should let her know if his cut hurt. With tears in her eyes, the young lady looked at him and said that she could not stop the bleeding and did not understand what to do. The young man sighed heavily. She closed her eyes because she felt severe pain. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. Amy froze with a puzzled look on her face. After a few seconds, he began to lick her wound. She was in shock and did not understand what he was doing. Knox asked if she could keep quiet for a bit as her coriacs were giving him a headache. She was taken aback and froze with embarrassment as she did not know what to say. A moment later, she pulled away from him and said that they had to discuss the book of magic they needed to get to it quickly. A moment later, she told him everything she knew and also asked if he would come into the house. She said that it was not very wise to go there late at night because there were a lot of monsters there, and it would be better for them to go during the day. She asked if it would be better if they went together. He asked, puzzled, why she should take the risk. Amy said that she was very worried about him because during the day he turned into a child. She looked at him intently and asked who in their right mind would let a child go into the forest alone. He sighed heavily and said that they had no other choice and that they had to go at night. She thought that it was still too dangerous to go anywhere at night. He looked at her intently and asked whether she would go with him or not. She sighed heavily and said that when people ask for something they say a magic word, and if he says it she will think about it. He asked in confusion what word she was talking about. She smiled and said that he should say please. The young man frowned and looked at her intently. A few seconds later he knelt down in front of her and asked with a predatory grin if she would like to come with him. The young lady was shocked and frozen with embarrassment, wondering if he had gone crazy. He looked at her with a smirk and asked if that was enough. Taken aback, she shouted that it was enough. She asked if he could stand up now. She was shocked and very confused by all his actions. Amy looked intently at the young man and said that they should go together tomorrow. He asked with great vehemence if they had known each other in the past. Looking away from him, she said that she didn't think so. He said that there was no benefit for her. He didn't understand why she decided to help him anyway. She smiled and said that she was just worried and couldn't let him go alone because life was given for humanity and helping others. Knox asked if she was saying she would make him an important part of her life. She was shocked and didn't understand how he even came to such a conclusion. She said with a smile that no answer was also an answer. She returned to the house with a satisfied smile, but he was dissatisfied with her answer. Some time later, she said goodbye to him as she was going to sleep in her sister's room. He was surprised and did not understand why she would do this. She said that her sister was not there and that she could sleep in another room. She looked away from him sheepishly and said that she would like to get a good night's sleep. Knox said he didn't remember ever disturbing her sleep. He said she had to explain so he could understand. Knox asked why she couldn't sleep next to him. Amy said that the bed was not big enough and they would be uncomfortable. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her. Amy looked after him intently and wished him good night. The next morning, she slowly opened her eyes as she heard someone calling her. She sleepily asked the boy what happened. She asked if he was looking for her because he couldn't find her. He nodded in agreement. Amy looked at him intently and said, Diana wasn't home, so she decided to sleep in her room. He looked at her intently but said nothing. She wished he could be so sweet at night. She asked with a smile if they would like some breakfast. The young lady stretched slowly, as she had not slept so well for a long time. A moment later, she asked the young man what he wanted for breakfast. He said she could make anything she wanted. A moment later, the boy tugged at her clothes and asked her not to leave him. Amy looked at the young man intently and said that she would not leave him. But in turn, she said with a smile that perhaps there was that house where they were waiting for him. He sighed heavily and said that it was so. She smiled and said that one day he would remember everything and something would change. Knox asked the girl what if he told her he wanted to stay, but she smiled and said that of course he could do that. She apologized to him for the harmless lie, but she knew that it would be better for him since he would be happy for a while. Amy, for her part, wondered if that was enough. That same night, they got ready as they wanted to go to the house. Amy said that in certain places Diana tied a white cloth so that they wouldn't get lost and they could follow her trail. A moment later, her lady companion told her companion how they should move. She thought for a moment and said that not only evil creatures but also poisonous plants awaited them, but she would tell him about this on the way. She knew perfectly well that her sister had no need to worry because they intended to return back safe and sound. Sometime later, they entered a dense forest. She looked closely at her companion and asked if he was scared. He said he was not scared. He also said that he is not afraid of ghosts, since dead people are not scary at all because they are not able to do anything. She smiled and asked if he remembered anything, but Knox said he only remembered small fragments. A moment later, he told her to be quiet as he noticed someone was nearby. He covered her with his body and they heard a distinct roar. Looking into the thick of the forest, they noticed someone's gaze. They realized that it was the Glyrises. These are magical creatures with their blue lion and bird wings. They also had blue blood and their power increased at night. Knox was puzzled because he didn't know what to do. Now Amy said that first he should get the sword. She said that he was still not used to holding the sword, but he should wait for her command. He said that he understood everything and would wait for the signal. At the same time, the animals were attacking them with a growl. After a few minutes, the young man quickly dealt with them. She was surprised that he succeeded. A moment later, he looked at her in surprise, not realizing what she had thrown. Amy said she had thrown dolomite. She said that the flying creature was vulnerable to dolomite. He was able to delay them for a while, but now they needed to hurry. He turned around, looked into the distance, and quietly said that it was too late. The young men froze for a moment when they saw the animals heading towards them. Amy was puzzled and wondered if the dolomite worked when they got stronger. Knox looked at them closely and said that their growling was getting louder and louder. He asked which route they should take as the entire flock would soon be gathered. A moment later, she told him the way he looked at her closely and told her to hold on tight. She looked at him in bewilderment, and a moment later he picked her up in his arms. And with the speed of lightning, they ran into the depths of the forest. She was shocked and screamed that he looked more like a wolf than a human. She was in shock because she knew they had to do something. A moment later, one shouted to her comrade to turn in soon. She shouted at him that if he continued in the same spirit, they would soon be in danger and therefore he must stop. A moment later, the young man stopped holding her in his arms. With the speed of lightning, he ran to one of the trees. But after some time, they finally rushed to the house. She asked for forgiveness since everything was for her. He said she warned him it would be dangerous, but she had undoubtedly gotten herself into trouble because of him. Knox said that from the moment she closed her eyes, it was clear that none of this was her will. He looked at her intently and asked if she was doing this because he was special to her. She looked at him silently, but he asked again if this was true. Amy said that of course he was special, and also asked if it wasn't natural to be kind to a child who had lost his forest. He asked if she was surprised that he had gotten older. She said that of course she was. Knox looked at her sharply and said that first they should go into the house and look for the book. She agreed with him. A moment later, they entered an empty house. They noticed that it was very dusty and assumed that no one lived in the house. Amy said there were no books on the first floor and suggested he check the second. She knew that this anomaly ended here and they would find out the reason no matter what. She looked closely after the young man because she knew that they would definitely solve everything. Amy looked closely and realized that on the first floor, there was only a kitchen and a living room. A moment later, she opened the door and froze in place as it was gloomy inside. She told the young man that they shouldn't go inside. A moment later, they reached the last room. Amy asked her companion if they should go inside. A moment later, they finally entered the room. Amy looked around closely and realized that there weren't many books there. She was interested in who owned this house. Amy suggested to her friend that they split up and check the room. A moment later, they looked intently at the small book. Knox looked at her intently and asked if she could read the books. She told him about all the books there were, but a moment later asked if something was wrong. He said that he could not read them because they were written in an ancient language, and he also asked how she knew him. She was shocked that he couldn't read them. During her studies with her sister, she learned this language but gave up the question, "Is it all because of reincarnation?" She said with a smile that she had taught him in the morning, and Knox had taught him too, so he could have read something. She told him that she taught her the ancient language in the mornings. He sighed heavily and said that it was a useless exercise. A moment later, he said that they could put the chosen books in the bag. The young lady looked closely at all the books, not knowing which one to choose. Amy saw a small necklace, and after reading about it, she was surrounded by energy. A moment later, a small seal appeared on her hand. She was shocked because she didn't understand what it was. Knox looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing there. Taken aback, she said that she had done nothing. The young lady looked closely at her companion and asked if he really had the ability to attract magical creatures. Knox said it was the first time he had heard of it. Amy was shocked because she knew that with her sister everything was completely different. A moment later, the young man asked her to wait a little. She said the wait could be tiring and they couldn't know when the creatures would disappear. But she looked around and realized that they had no choice. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and told her companion that she had an idea. She smiled, a radiant smile, and said that she remembered about poisonous plants. He looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that not far from them were the plants she had spoken about earlier. Titus poisonous plant growing in dark thickets. The plant's seeds explode when approached directly. This releases deadly gas and juice. She smiled and explained to him everything about this plant. She smiled and said that dolomite only caused temporary paralysis and Titus was a poison. He looked at her in surprise and asked how they would assemble it then. Amy smiled and asked how they could take it without touching it. A moment later, the young man struck the plant with his sword, knocking it down. He looked at her closely and asked if a few branches were enough for them. She consoled him because he said that they remembered how to handle their sword. He said that the more he held the sword in his hands, the more things began to become clear to him. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard an alarming sound. She wondered if the sword could bring back lost memories. She didn't understand how things could turn out if he remembered everything. They discussed their strategy for some time. Amy said they were surrounded by creatures with a developed sense of smell and hearing. She said that she would use poison to paralyze their charms, and then he would throw a stone, thus depriving them of hearing. She said that while the creatures were confused, they would go their own way. She looked at him intently and said that she would give him a sign to act. A moment later, the young lady threw the grass at her comrade and shouted at her friend to follow her lead. As she ran away, she realized that the noise was phenomenal. Amy wondered how strong he was. Knox shouted at the girl to rely on him like it was the last time. She looked at him in surprise as she had not expected this. A moment later, the young man grabbed her in his arms and started running. She showed him the way and said that she would find out everything and he should trust her. The young lady looked closely at her savior, as she knew he was just a beast. He carried the heavy luggage as well as her and still managed to escape. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that something was following them. She looked into the distance in bewilderment as she wanted to know what was following them. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw one creature growling and running towards them. She screamed, and meanwhile he fought with the beast. But after a few minutes, his sword slipped from his hands. He ran with the speed of lightning, and after a while they finally arrived at a safe place and fell to the ground with a crash. Amy sighed heavily because she knew that if they did this again, she would not survive. She looked closely at her friend and asked if he was okay. She wanted to know if he was hurt by any chance. He said that she was talking nonsense again and also asked what was wrong with her hand. Let's run to the young lady who said that it was all because she was throwing names with her bare hand, but everything was fine with her. Knox looked at her intently and said that she had gone too far for him, and now she continued to say that he was not special to her. She looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile if she had really said that he was special to her. He asked if he was special because he reincarnated as his child. He said that she didn't even need to justify herself. Knox said that unfortunately he did not remember anything of what she had told him about him during the daytime. She looked at him in bewilderment and said that she could not understand anything about what he had said. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted her to sleep with him. The young lady was taken aback as she did not expect to hear anything like that. He said that he only sees her at night, so he asked if she would refuse him. She looked at him in surprise and asked, "When you were?" She refused him. Knox said that only she knew the truth about him and he did not intend to touch her because he only wanted her to sleep with him today. The young lady froze in shock and called out to him in bewilderment. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock as she saw blood on her hands. The young lady in turn was taken aback as she saw blood on her hands. She was in shock and asked her friend to wake up. She gently laid him on the ground and realized that he had wounds on his back. When she touched him, she realized that he had a fever. She noticed that his heart was racing and his breathing was rapid. She knew she needed to get him home immediately. Amy, in turn, was not wounded, and after examining her body, she realized that she did not have any serious wounds. Amy, with the speed of lightning, pulled the young man and sighed heavily since he was very heavy. But a moment later, she was taken aback since she understood that it was already morning and he should have turned into a child. She was in shock. She didn't understand what to do because she saw that it was already morning, but he was still in the form of an adult. She froze and wondered if the time for transformation had already passed. Amy didn't understand how this was possible, but in turn she wondered how she would explain everything to her sister if he no longer reincarnated, because she knew that her sister should return soon. A moment later, she heard a crash and turned around. She froze in surprise when she saw the young man in the boy's body. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he reincarnated only at noon. Sometime later, she carried him into the house and observed his condition. Amy quietly sat next to the young man and was puzzled by the whole situation because she did not know what it meant. She knew that the magic spell transformed him into a specific time. Something like this morning simply could not happen. She was excited and did not understand why everything happened this way and understood that something was wrong in these days. She remembered the white beam in that house. She knew that her necklace had the same magical sign as on her palm. She sighed heavily because she understood that the problem was in the necklace. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard Nox calling her. The young lady rushed to the young man in a hurry as she noticed that he had already woken up. She sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that he was wounded. Nox looked into the distance, embarrassed, and said that he was in pain. Amy looked at the boy sadly and said that he should take his medicine and stay in bed today. She asked if he had pain anywhere else besides his back and arm. He didn't answer her. She sighed heavily because she knew that looking at the young man, both adult and youth, it was difficult for her to understand them. A moment later, she pulled away from him as she wanted to bring him something to eat. Nox caught her by the clothes and asked where she was going. She said that she would change the towel and bring him something to eat so he should wait. Amy looked at the young man intently and asked if she could leave. Nox said that he did not want her to go anywhere. She sighed heavily as she had previously asked him not to look at her with puppy dog eyes. She smiled and said that she had no choice and also asked if he wanted to come down with her. She took him in her arms with a smile. Amy looked at the boy closely and said that in order for him to recover faster, he should not move. He sighed heavily and said that it would be great if he was sick all the time. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand why his friend would say something like that. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that on days like these, she was always there for him. He smiled and asked if she would stay with him forever. The young lady was taken aback and said that of course she would stay with him. She was ashamed to say such a thing as she knew that she could not do it. Of course she couldn't tell him the truth, but she still continued to care for him. Nox looked at her in surprise and asked her worriedly if she was hurt. She smiled shyly and said that she was a little hurt because she was walking yesterday, but she was fine. Amy looked at the boy with a gentle smile and asked him not to worry. She smiled and said that she went out because something needed to be done, but that it wouldn't happen again. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she needed to do. Amy looked at the boy and said that she was still quite worried about his wounds and it would be great if he was not wounded. Nox shouted that she must not hit herself anywhere and if she was hurt he would bear the pain in her place. Nox said that neither of them would be hurt. She smiled and said that if he had eaten enough, then they could go back to bed and she would sleep next to him. Nox asked if he was going to sleep now, so he could stay awake at night. She looked at him in bewilderment. He said that he didn't want to sleep because he wanted to be with her at night. She smiled and said that she needed to do something at night. Nox looked at her closely and asked what she needed to do, and he also wanted to know if she was going to meet someone at night. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and asked who the man she was dating was. That same night, she saw a young man who had become an adult again. Nox looked at her closely and said that he had been looking for her. He wanted to know where she had gone. She was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Amy asked where she could have gone since she had been doing all the previously postponed chores around the house, and all this time she had been in the house. Amy looked intently at the young man and asked if he was hungry. She froze for a moment as he stared at her, but a moment later, Nox said she was far away. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. Nox asked why she sat so far away from him. Amy looked at him in bewilderment and said that she was sitting very close. The young man quickly moved closer to her and said that he would like to take a closer look at her face. She froze for a moment, not understanding what was happening at all. Amy was confused but at the same time shocked because she did not understand why he was suddenly touching her. She asked what he was doing because he scared her. Amy screamed and told the young man that he shouldn't touch someone. So suddenly he looked at her closely and said that he didn't know that. She was surprised and said that these were elementary things that he should have known. Nox said that he did not remember anything and she must have forgotten about it. Amy looked closely at the young man and asked if he had a fever again. He looked her straight in the eyes and said that he was not sick at all. The young lady said that if he wants to take a person by the hand, he must first ask permission, because that is the basis. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't know that either. Knox said with a slight smirk that he hoped that she would teach him everything in the future. He also wondered why she, having picked up a child, was not prepared for something like this. The young lady in turn froze for a moment. He looked at her with a grin and said that she should have gotten used to this by now. The young lady in turn froze in shock as she could not say anything to him. A moment later, she screamed and said that it was time for him to take his medicine, so she would go and get it. Knox said that this was not necessary, and he would accompany her. She was taken aback because she did not understand what was being discussed. A moment later, the young man lifted her into his arms. Amy was in shock and did not understand why a sick person was carrying another. She screamed for him to let her go immediately. Knox, looking at the young lady in all seriousness, said that the more she twitched, the more it hurt him. She looked at him closely and said with a nervous smile that he himself had recently said that he was not sick. He sighed heavily and said that this happens, and he just felt a little unwell. Amy was in shock, wondering if she was really supposed to believe this. Now she was confused. She didn't understand what was wrong with him at all. Amy glanced sideways at her companion and asked if the soup would suit him. She said that if he suddenly didn't like the food, she could make him a sandwich or give him some stew. He smiled and said that everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry about it. She smiled and said that the soup was good for digestion, and daytime Knox ate it very well. Knox was surprised. She smiled and said that she added medicinal herbs, and this will help him recover faster. Knox looked at the dish in surprise and asked how he could eat it. She sighed heavily and said that she fed him with her own spoon. Knox said that in that case she would do it now. The young lady was taken aback as she did not expect such a thing. Knox looked at her intently and said that she should feed him. Amy looked at him in surprise and said that as a baby he couldn't move his arm, so she fed him. He sighed heavily and said that he couldn't use his hand. She froze in surprise and wondered if he had heard what she said. He sighed heavily and asked the young lady if there was a reason why she could feed him during the day, but now she could not do so. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was joking. Knox said he was not joking at all. The young lady in turn understood that it was useless to argue with him, and she said that she would feed him but only once. A moment later, he grabbed her and lifted her up. Amy froze in fear. A few seconds later, he easily sat her down on the table. The lady was very surprised and could not utter a word. Knox looked at the lady with a smirk and asked if people weren't supposed to be at eye level when she was feeding someone. Amy, in turn, froze in embarrassment. She was puzzled and did not understand what kind of situation this was. A moment later, she began feeding. Looking at the young man, she asked if it was tasty. He sighed heavily and said that it was very tasty. She slowly looked away from him as she had the feeling that she had been fooled. A moment later, she looked at the young man and said that sister should return tomorrow. Knox, in turn, coldly said that he understood her. Amy couldn't stop talking about her sister with a joyful smile because last time she brought new clothes and a lot of goodies, so she was looking forward to her sister. Knox sighed heavily and said that their opinions differed. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. At the same time, the young lady finally reached the city. A moment later, she turned around as she heard someone calling her. Diana looked at Hans and greeted him with a smile since they had not seen each other for a long time. He smiled and said that several months had passed. Diana looked at him intently and asked how he had been doing all this time. Hans said that he had no problems, but he was still very worried since he had not seen her for a long time. She smiled and said that she had been a little busy for the last month. He asked if she was still hunting monsters. Diana said that now, sometimes she only saw low-class monsters, and also asked her companion what happened. He sighed heavily and said that something was bothering him. She looked at him in bewilderment. A moment later, the man looked back and quietly approached her. He said that recently there had been rumors that dozens of corpses were appearing nearby and that mercenaries were looking for a way to make money here. Hans said that a squad of knights was hanging around here. She looked at him in surprise as she had not expected this. He said that it was so, but the strangest thing was that they hid their identities and they were not going to draw their swords. He said that she should know about the dragon emblem because it was the symbol of the Imperial family, and he clearly saw a red medal with an image of a dragon. Hans said that it seemed to be a punitive detachment of large monsters that had recently appeared nearby, and it was said before that even the Emperor himself had taken part in this. But if this was the case, then the situation with the monsters would change completely. Diana thought for a moment and said that it was most likely so. The man told his friend that unfortunately no one knows when the punitive operation will begin, so she must be careful. He looked at her intently and said that if anything went wrong, it would be better for her to hide in the village. A moment later, he handed her some medicinal herbs that he had collected. Diana thanked him. She thought for a moment about what he said. After all, the red dragon medallion could only be used by the Imperial family. Those who had such a medal were members of the Imperial family or people of high standing who carried out quests. She knew that the medals were distinguished by their color. If it was gold, it was the Emperor, if it was green, the Empress, and if it was red, the Crown Prince. She understood that if the Imperial order was nearby, then something had happened. A moment later, the young man was taken aback and looked into the distance in surprise as he saw a small house. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly over her books. Before giving Knox this book, she decided to check the contents herself, but unfortunately, she didn't understand anything. Even though she could read, she didn't remember the academic style, and it was like a different language to her. All spells began with a prayer. Its use and removal, its beginning and end, all began with a prayer. She only read the introduction, and the information in it was like one of the pages of a reference book. She sighed heavily because she wanted to look at the pictures. A moment later, she looked at the small image in surprise as she saw a drawing of the necklace she had found earlier in the abandoned house, Matari, an ancient spell that had not yet been fully studied. She was puzzled because there was no precise description. She saw that there was only one sentence. Amy was a little confused and upset, as the book contained no information about the strange phenomenon. She wondered if the book had anything to do with her friend's magic. A moment later, Knox walked up to the young lady and asked what she was staring at. Amy smiled and asked if the clothes fit him. He sighed heavily and said that everything fit him. A moment later, the young lady said that she would like to talk to him about the book as she had not been able to read it. He looked at her in bewilderment. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she could not understand the content. She said that she could read it out loud and he would listen. She said that what she didn't understand, perhaps he could understand. Knox sighed heavily and said that he wasn't sure. She knew perfectly well that his knowledge was greater than hers, for he was a great duke and she was only a country bumpkin. After reading it, she looked at him intently and asked if he understood anything. Knox sighed heavily and said that as he expected, he did not understand anything. She sighed heavily, hoping that they could get a clue. Amy looked puzzled and said that it would be good if she understood what was written there. Knox looked at her sharply and said that he did not blame her for anything and it was not her fault at all. She sighed heavily because she wanted to help him, but unfortunately it was not in her power. She understood that she had lived a difficult life, but there was no use in it. Knox looked closely at the young lady and stroked her head tenderly. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. He sighed heavily and, looking at her, said that he should have asked permission first. He looked at her intently and asked if he could touch her head. She looked at him in surprise, then a moment later looked away from him with embarrassment and said that he had already touched her head and still asked for permission. A moment later he reached for her again, but she gently pushed him away. After a few seconds, they both turned around and stared at the door. Knox asked anxiously what that sound was. She was taken aback and said that it was coming from the front gate. Knox said that he would go right away and check everything. Amy looked closely at the young man and said that he should hide in the house if it was some suspicious person, then he would help her, but if he thought that she was alone, then he would certainly show himself. A moment later, the young lady approached the door and wanted to know who was behind the door, but after a few seconds she was taken aback. Amy froze for a moment in surprise as she saw her sister. Amy was shocked and worried, asked her sister what happened. Diana sighed heavily and said that nothing special happened, she just had to run. Diana looked at her sister and said that she did not have time to explain. Her sister must listen to her carefully. She told her to take Knox immediately, and they hid together in the barn. Amy was in shock. She didn't understand what was going on at all. Diana said that she would go right now and look around. Amy looked at her in surprise and asked if someone had really been near the house. Diana looked around and said that she had heard from her comrades that invaders had appeared in the forest. Amy was taken aback and wondered if this was the Crown Prince's nightly troop. She knew that, of course, it wasn't certain, but in the book, Knox lived here for about a year. She was excited and did not understand why the detachment appeared so early. She was excited, looked at her sister and asked if someone was following her. Diana sighed heavily and said that they were mercenaries. A group of mercenaries appeared on the outskirts of the village, and clashes were taking place there. She looked at her sister closely and said that unfortunately she did not have time to tell all the details as they had to hide immediately, and then they could talk. The young lady agreed and asked her sister to be careful. Diana smiled and told her sister not to worry as they had grown up in a similar area for more than 10 years. Diana smiled and said that people were no scarier than monsters and that she could handle them. She smiled and patted her sister on the head, and also said with a smile that she would be back soon. Amy stared after her sister. A moment later she called to Knox, who peered out from behind the door. She looked at him excitedly and asked if he had heard what her sister had said, that there were many of them. He sighed heavily and said that it looked like it, and it seemed to him that someone was walking straight towards the house. Knox looked into the distance and said that there were more than 3 of them. Amy looked at her companion with excitement and told him to follow her immediately, as now was not the time to stand still. He looked at her in surprise and asked where they were going. She pushed him with all her strength and asked if he hadn't heard what her sister had said because they had to hide. Knox looked at her with bewilderment and asked why they suddenly had to hide. She looked at him with no less surprise and asked if they were really just going to stand there. He asked if that was really not possible. Amy was furious. She screamed that, of course, this was not right, and besides, he had been poisoned. He said that he was fine and she didn't need to worry. She screamed that she had already told him earlier that he shouldn't underestimate the poison. Amy said that even if everything turns out to be normal, now everything could get worse because despite the fact that the pain is dulled, it can only get worse. She said that if he moved abruptly, his temperature might rise again. She sighed heavily and asked him to listen to her and go with her. She screamed that his old wound could reopen and the poison would be active. The toxin would enter the bloodstream and cause paralysis, and it would be so strong that the young man could die. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and shouted that he understood everything, and the poison was very dangerous. He always looked at her with skill and asked if she was not at all worried about her sister, since she had gone off alone to fight a large number of enemies. Amy sighed heavily and said that she was very worried, but her sister was strong, so she believed that nothing bad would happen to her. She looked closely at the young man and said that the problem now was him and her, but she said that there was a safe place nearby so they should go there and hide. He looked at her closely and asked if her sister hadn't spoken about his daytime appearance. He didn't think there was a place where he could hide. The young lady followed and didn't look at him. A moment later, Knox said he thought they were too late. A few seconds later, a group of people appeared in front of them. The men looked at the young lady with fierce grins and said that there was another girl near the house, but it was not the one they were chasing. They thought that the girls were sisters because they looked alike. The man looked at them with a grin and asked why they had turned so pale. He mockingly asked if it was all from fear. Amy looked at her companion intently and asked if he could be patient for a little while, because if they threw that herb at the mercenaries, they would be paralyzed for a short time. He thought for a moment and asked how long they would be paralyzed. She thought for a moment and said that the herb would paralyze them for 5 minutes, and they would have 5 minutes to escape. Knox looked closely at the young people and asked if there was any reason to keep them alive for these minutes. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. But a moment later, the young lady screamed and called for her friend, but it was all in vain. With lightning speed, the young man rushed towards the group of mercenaries. Amy in turn froze in shock at this sight. She was shocked because the young man dealt with the mercenaries with such ease. Knox turned around and, looking at his companion, asked what to do next. But the young lady could not hold on and fell to the ground with a crash. She trembled as she was afraid of him. He came closer to her and noticed that she was trembling. A few seconds later, Nox sat down next to her and, taking her hand, asked if she was afraid of him. She froze in a daze and could not answer his question. Even though he had lost his memory, he could easily defeat several men. She knew that this was the great Duke. Amy knew very well about his cruelty, but when she saw everything with her own eyes, she became very scared. Amy looked at the young man closely and said that he was the man who protected her, so she was not afraid of him. Nox smiled and told his companion that she was like a day star, for her hair illuminated the darkness of the night. It was so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off it. He looked at her tenderly and said that even in the body of a child he missed her. Amy in turn froze for a moment in embarrassment. She had a feeling as if her heart would explode at that very moment. She was taken aback because she didn't know what to answer. He looked at her intently, and pulling her closer to him, said that she should not avoid his gaze because he always looked only at her. He sighed heavily and asked her not to avoid him. She was shocked and didn't know what to answer to his words. She said that this couldn't be done. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she felt that he was very hot. She screamed and called him, but it was all in vain. Amy noticed that the young man was breathing heavily. She was in shock and screamed for him to wake up. Nox sighed heavily and said that he was fine. She knew it was a lie because he was hot. She was excited, looked at him and asked if he had really been in pain while he was fighting those people. Amy was furious and screamed that she had told him earlier that his temperature might rise. She had told him not to act recklessly. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he did this. Nox sighed heavily and said that he just couldn't leave things as they were, but he was fine and she shouldn't worry. With tears in her eyes, she screamed and asked where this was normal. She was furious because she knew he was already used to enduring pain. A moment later, the young man made a long, painful sound, and the young lady looked at him with alarm and called out. She was surprised because she saw that the sun had risen, but at the same time she was puzzled because she did not understand why he had not yet become a child. She was scared and didn't understand how things had changed, because this wasn't the case in the original. Amy was taken aback when she saw blood on her companion. She looked at him with fear and wondered if he had been recently wounded. She didn't understand what to do if he couldn't wake up because she understood that they might never see each other again after this incident. She was in shock and simply could not believe it. With tears in her eyes, she screamed and called him, but at the same time, she called him Renok. She burst into tears and asked him to wake up. She looked at him intently and asked him to stand up. A moment later, the young lady fell with a crash onto his chest and began to cry. But after a few seconds, she was taken aback as she saw a glow appear around them. She was surprised and didn't understand what was going on. She looked at the young man in bewilderment and wondered if it had really just gotten too early. She saw that he was gradually beginning to change his appearance. The young lady was taken aback as she saw that in an instant he had become a child again. She looked at him with fear and wondered if the fever had gone down. Reaching out for it, she froze as she saw the seal on her hand glow. Amy was surprised and at the same time puzzled when she saw the symbol on her hand again. She wondered if it was all because of her. But a few seconds later, she fell with a crash on the young man. Some time later, the young man opened his eyes as he clearly heard someone calling him. He was puzzled because he did not remember what had happened in precision. Nox slowly rose to a sitting position. He turned around and looked with bewilderment at the young lady who was breathing heavily next to him. He noticed her heavy breathing and wondered if she was ill. He reached out to his friend and looked at her intently, unable to tear his gaze away. He thought for a moment because when he opened his eyes, there was a girl next to him who was unfamiliar to him. He saw that she was scared then, but still trembling with fear. She informed him that she was the mistress of the house and also asked if he could let her go first. She also informed him that she had given him a new name. Unfortunately, he didn't remember anything, but she still gave a name to someone who didn't have one. He knew that she was a person who was not afraid of him at all. He was puzzled because he did not understand, since when he began to desire her, he sighed heavily as he longed for the man he could only see at night. But for a moment he froze and was lost in his thoughts because he understood that it was very strange because she called him by a different name. He was puzzled because he did not understand why she called him that way, but for some reason, this name seemed familiar to him. He slowly reached out to the young lady and brushed a strand of hair from her face. But a moment later, Diana entered the room and froze for a moment. She was taken aback and looking at the young man in surprise asked who he was. Amy in turn slowly opened her eyes as she heard some noise. She jumped out of bed and looked intently at her sister. Diana looked menacingly at her sister and told her to duck her head immediately. Amy looked at her sister in bewilderment as she did not understand what you were talking about. A moment later, Diana, with the speed of lightning, grabbed a fork and threw it at the young man and also shouted at him to immediately get away from her sister Nox. With the speed of lightning, dodged the fork that was flying straight towards him. Amy shuddered and looked at the young man in surprise. A moment later, Diana was flying towards him with a knife in her hand. She quickly climbed onto the bed as she wanted to immediately deal with her boyfriend. She looked at him with fury and shouted at him to leave immediately, or he would never hear the ringing of his bells again. Amy looked at her sister with fear and said it wasn't what she thought. Diana quietly told her sister that she would detain the young man and that she should quickly grab Nox in her arms and run away. Amy looked intently at her sister and told her to listen to her first. Diana did not want to hear anything and shouted at her sister to run away immediately. Amy grabbed her sister with lightning speed and hugged her, telling her that she shouldn't attack the young man because everything was wrong. She screamed in shock that this man was Nox. Diana was taken aback and froze in shock as she had not expected to hear anything like that at all. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the young man and looked at him intently. Sometime after the young men had finished their story, she looked at them intently and asked her sister if she really wanted to say that the young man in front of them was Nox. Diana looked closely at the young man because she understood that if you looked closely, the eyes and face looked similar, but she was surprised she did not understand if this was possible since he matured very quickly. Amy smiled and said that Diana had said everything correctly, but he had not just grown up. Diana looked at them intently and asked if she would never be able to see Nox again. Amy said that it is not so because during the day he becomes a child and at night an adult. Diana breathed a sigh of relief and said that she understood everything, and that meant that dear Nox still existed. Amy looked at her sister in bewilderment and wondered if that was really the problem. Diana in turn sighed heavily and said that since Kana had not seen everything with her own eyes, it seemed to her, and to tell the truth, it was difficult for her to believe in such a thing. Amy. You in turn knew that of course if she had not read it in a book, she would not have believed it either. Diana looked closely at the young man and asked if he really looked like this every night. Amy was taken aback and told her sister that this was true, but she shouldn't worry since he, on the contrary, was protecting her from danger. Diana looked at them intently and told her sister that if you look at it like that, it looks like she likes it, but Nox and he is ready to listen to her. Amy looked at them with confusion and asked what they should do now. A moment later, Diana laughed hysterically. Amy looked at her sister with concern. Diana looked at her sister closely and said that they could not ignore what was threatening her safety. She also said that tomorrow morning she must make sure that it was the Nox she knew. Diana looked at her sister in surprise and asked why she had remained silent until now, because if she had really been worried, she would have told her the whole truth earlier. The young lady came and asked for forgiveness. Diana looked closely at the young man and said that they were finished talking. She also asked the young man to go to his room or to some other one because her sister had to stay the night with her. Amy looked at her sister with confusion. Diana asked her sister with bewilderment what kind of expression she had on her face. Now Diana wanted to know if her sister was really planning to sleep with an older man. Amy was taken aback and said that this was not entirely true. The young man in turn said that the young lady would stay with him for the night. Amy sighed heavily and said that she could not do this, since in their house one had to obey one's sister. Diana looked closely at the young man, and with a soft smile said that she understood his displeasure, but while he was in this house, he had to obey her. Nox walked closer to the young lady and looked deeply into her eyes. She smiled shyly and told him to let her go. He stared at her for a moment, not daring to let her go, but a moment later he took his hand from hers and sighing heavily said that he understood her. As he left, he wished them good night. Thus ended the long night, but in the morning the young man became a child again. Diana in turn looked at the young man with embarrassment as she was glad that she was able to see the little boy again. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to him and hugged him tightly. Convinced that during the day he became a child, she stopped wanting to throw him out of the house, and everyone remained in their places. Amy was glad that everything ended well and all the troubles were gone, but she was also glad that she no longer had to sleep in a cramped bed with a young man. But a moment later she sat up as something still bothered her. She had a strange feeling and she decided to go get a drink of water, but at the same time she looked intently at her sister who was fast asleep. A moment later she slowly rose and sleepily walked into the kitchen. A few seconds later she screamed loudly as Knox appeared unexpectedly and startled her. He looked at her intently, but said nothing as he saw that she was frightened. She looked at him in surprise because she knew that they had only been apart for a day, but he already missed her. She looked at him with a smile and said that sister allowed him to live with them. Amy smiled and asked if that was wonderful. The young man in turn looked at her intently but did not answer. She looked at him in bewilderment as she was waiting for an answer. A moment later, the young lady asked in bewilderment if something had happened. She was puzzled because she did not understand what was wrong with his face, but a moment later she was taken aback as he slowly touched her hair and pulled her towards him. He looked at her intently and said sadly that he could only see her at night. Looking into her eyes, he said in all seriousness that a night without her had no meaning for him. She was shocked because the young man was very handsome and hot, and at the same time he said such words, thus he simply bewitched her. A moment later she pushed him out of the room and said that if they stood in the room, sister could hear them, so they needed to move to the living room. She said that while sister was sleeping, and before they were caught, they could talk. He looked at her intently and asked if they could do anything if they were not caught. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he wanted to do. Knox in turn asked if she would allow him to tell. She looked at him in bewilderment and said that he had to tell first. In all seriousness, the young man looked at her intently and said that he would like to sleep with her. Amy froze in shock as she had not expected to hear anything like that. He sighed heavily and told her that unfortunately he could not sleep without her. Knox said that for this reason they could sleep together. She was shocked, did not understand how he could say such a thing. Sighing heavily, the young lady said that this was not possible. He said that they might not get caught, but still asked if this was really not possible. She turned her embarrassed gaze away from him and said that they would definitely be caught, because her sister was a light sleeper, and she had already made a decision about them. Amy said that they couldn't ignore her words. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed like her sister cared about her very much. Amy said that of course she did, and she cared about Knox too. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she really meant his daytime image. He was puzzled because he did not understand why everyone liked him so much in the daytime. Amy thought for a moment and remembered his daytime image. She understood that it would be better for him not to know this. He looked at her closely and called out timidly. Knox said that he had been waiting for the moment when he could see her again. He slowly took her hand and said that he really wanted them to be together longer. Amy froze for a moment and looked at the young man intently as he spoke ambiguous words to her. He pulled her hand towards his face and asked with a smile if he could at least get permission to do that. She stood there embarrassed, not knowing what to answer, but after a few seconds she timidly shouted that this was not right. He looked at her with bewilderment because he did not understand why he could not do this. She sighed heavily and, covering her face from embarrassment, said that it was all because they could become closer. He looked at her with bewilderment, asked if they did not have a close relationship. Knox asked his companion if she didn't like him. She looked at him confusedly and said that it was not so, and that was not what she meant. Amy sighed heavily and said that what was lost would return someday, and his memories should return to him soon, and when that happens, everything will change. She knew that when he remembered everything, he would meet the main character and be happy with her. She was very afraid to become too attached to someone who would soon leave her. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that he wanted her at any time, be it night or day. Amy was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. He said in all seriousness that he didn't want to remember anything at all. The young lady froze for a moment. She did not know what to answer him, but a moment later she came to her senses and shouted that this couldn't be done, because when he remembered everything, he would be happy. Amy said that instead of living in the wilderness, he should find his memories and go back to where he came from, go back to his place and be happy with other people. He froze for a moment and looked at her intently, but after a few seconds he sighed heavily and said that this was probably how she imagined his happiness. Knox leaned towards the young lady, took her hand and looked into her eyes, said that he wished for the happiness he had spent with her tonight. She sighed heavily and said that she could only do it tonight. She hoped that if she returned before her sister woke up, everything would be fine. But a moment later they were taken aback as Diana glared at them and asked them angrily what they were doing now. Amy was taken aback because she did not expect to see her sister. She hesitated because she did not know what to answer. Diana walked up to her sister blazing with anger, but smiling, and told her to quickly go to her room. So several months of their life together passed. They joyfully spent every moment together. Amy, with a joyful smile, told the boy that it was time for them to return. Knox, in turn, followed the young lady closely, not letting her go for a single step. The day Diana caught them, she was very angry. The problem was that they got caught several times, but in the end they could only meet under Diana's supervision. Diana watched them more than once, and yet she was able to make sure that there were no problems, and then she was able to calm down. After some time, the three of them finally got used to living together. Amy was puzzled because she was now being treated as a problem person. The young lady knew that the real problem person was her sister because she had brought a stranger into the house. A moment later, her thoughts were dispelled as Diana asked her to step outside for a few minutes. Diana looked closely at the boy and said that she would like to talk to her sister without him. Amy looked at the sweet angel with a smile and said that they would be back soon. A moment later, the young lady approached her sister and asked if something had happened. She knew that her sister had gone to harvest the crops, but she was worried because she didn't understand what was wrong with her clothes. Diana sighed heavily and said that while she was harvesting, monsters had attacked her, so she was all battered. Diana looked at her sister with excitement and said that last time she heard that an Imperial punitive detachment to fight monsters had appeared, and she thought that it was really so. Diana sighed heavily and said that she had picked up a suspicious person again. Amy was shocked as she understood that her sister had stepped on the same rake again. Diana said she wanted to ignore him completely, but he said he was looking for the child in the woods. She was worried because she knew there was a possibility he was somehow connected to Knox. She also knew he could be dangerous, so she locked him in the barn. A moment later, they opened the barn and looked closely at the young man, Diana saying that they should check him out. Opening the door, the young lady froze for a moment as the young man begged them to let him go. Amy froze for a moment and looked intently at the young man as she saw his ash-blonde hair and blue eyes. She was in shock as she understood that most likely this was Knight Grey. Grey Winston, a knight who had a special position in the Rinoha Knight Squad Lux. In the future, he would play an important role in the fight against the Crown Prince. He was very strong. Moreover, he is a very important person who will help the main characters realize their feelings. Lady was shocked as she understood that he had already suffered enough. Grey looked at them excitedly and said that he planned to leave quietly after he found the person he had been looking for so long. He said that he had no other intentions, so he sincerely asked them to untie him. Diana looked closely at the young man and said that there were a lot of suspicious people around who were hiding their true identity, and unfortunately they couldn't believe what he said. He sighed heavily and said that they should look at him as he did not understand what he could do to them in such a state. With tears in his eyes, the young man looked at them and asked if the man who tied him up and defeated him was not here. Diana smiled and said that it was. She looked at him intently and asked sternly what the child he was looking for looked like. Grey looked away from them and said that the young man was half his height. He had black hair and purple eyes. The young ladies, in turn, looked at each other. Diana quietly told her sister that she wasn't sure which soldier he belonged to, but he was definitely looking for Knox. The young man asked them excitedly why they were whispering. A moment later, Knox approached them and asked the girls who this young man was. Diana was shocked and shouted to the boy that she had told him to wait near the house. She did not understand why he came to them. In turn, Knox looked intently at the young man. Grey recognized his commander and shouted. The girls were puzzled. Grey stood up abruptly and shouted to the commander that it was him, and he also introduced himself. He wanted to know how his commander survived and wanted to know about his state of health. Knox, in turn, trembled from such pressure and hid behind the young lady. The young man shouted to the commander that he thought he was wounded. He shouted that he was really very worried. With the speed of lightning, he rushed towards the commander, but unfortunately, since his legs were tied, he collapsed to the ground. The young men looked at him intently. The young lady looked closely at the young man and asked if he was okay. Gray in turn began to slowly rise, and sighing heavily said that he was okay. Knox grabbed his friend's hand and told her not to touch him. Amy looked at the boy in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he did this. Knox looked at the young man with disdain and said that he was dirty, and she should not touch him. For a moment there was dead silence between them. The young man was in shock, bursting into tears. He shouted to the commander that he was not dirty at all, and as soon as he washed himself, he would be clean. Moments later, Diana sighed heavily and said that they should drop the conversation, as she thought the young man was not dangerous at all. She looked at them intently and said that they could talk later, and she also asked the young man if he wanted to wash his dirty body first. The young man was shocked, and with tears in his eyes asked them to stop calling him dirty. After the young man had taken a hasty shower, he looked closely at everyone present and with a radiant smile said that he would like to introduce himself again and said that his name was Gray. The sisters looked at him intently and introduced themselves with sweet smiles. Diana looked closely at the young man and asked what his relationship was with Knox Gray, looked at them in surprise as the name was unfamiliar to him. Diana smiled and said that the child did not know his name, so they gave him a new name. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, Knox hugged the young lady and informed her that he wanted to sleep. Amy smiled and said that in that case, they should go to the room. She smiled and said that the boy seemed to be very tired, and now she needed to go and put him to bed. Gray was very surprised, as he did not expect to see something like this. Gray looked after them in bewilderment. He was stunned and could not answer anything. Diana looked closely at the young knight and told him not to be surprised and to listen to her carefully. She sighed heavily and said that she did not know who he was to the boy, but unfortunately the child did not remember anything. Gray was shocked by this information. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he lost all his memories. Gray was puzzled and now understood why the young master did not pay any attention to him, because he did not remember him. Amy knew very well that if the young duke ordered his knights to die, they would jump into the abyss without a doubt, because their loyalty was so strong, especially Gray, because he followed Renoc unquestioningly. She knew that his master had lost his memories, and it was very painful for him. Amy looked closely at the young man and asked how his wound was, since she was going to help him with its treatment. He looked at her in surprise, but still thanked her. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she had become attached to their commander. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if she really wasn't allowed to do that. He was taken aback and said that it wasn't so, and he was just asking. Gray, looking away from the young lady, said that this was the first time he had seen a commander who had lost his memories. He smiled and said that no matter whether it was night or day, he never left the people close to him. He asked the young lady if she saw his night image because it was the true appearance of their commander. Gray said with a joyful smile that Renoc Iberian, the real name of their commander. Diana, taken aback, asked if this was really the same war hero. The young man smiled and said that it was exactly so, and he, the head of the duchy in the north and the most powerful man. Diana was shocked and could not imagine such a thing. She understood that despite the fact that he was a child who had lost all his memories, he had to return to the post of Duke Gray, said that this was so, and with the loss of memory, the best solution would be to return him to his place. He looked closely at Diana and said that many people wish and wait for the commander to return to his place. She sighed heavily and said with their sadness that this was so. Amy smiled and said that they talked a little about how the young man would live. She asked the knight if he would like to hear how the young duke lived all this time after a short story. Gray blazed with happiness, because despite the fact that his commander had lost all his memories, he was still strong. Looking at the young lady, he asked if anything else had happened. He wanted to hear about everything. Amy sighed heavily as she had a feeling that he was about to wag his tail. She noticed that he was a very nice person. A moment later, Diana stood up and told her sister that she was very tired, so she was going to go to bed. Amy smiled and told her sister that she could go first. Diana told the young knight that he could use the barn as a place to stay for the night. He smiled and thanked her. Amy looked closely at the young man and said that Knox would soon wake up in his body. Although he did not remember anything, she asked the knight if he wanted to talk to the commander. Gray thanked her with a smile, whining to the lady for her concern. He didn't have time to finish speaking when Knox suddenly entered the room. He was taken aback when he saw that Amy was sitting next to an attractive young man. Gray looked at the commander with a joyful smile and shouted. But a moment later, Knox, with the speed of lightning, grabbed the young man by the clothes and threw him to the ground. He looked at the young lady with fury and called her name. She flinched at the tone of his voice. He looked at her intently and asked angrily if she had picked up another man. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, she looked away from him and said that it was not she who had brought him but sister. The young man was in shock. He shouted to the commander, told them who he was. Gray shouted that he was the one who carried the commander and raised him. Knox looked closely at the young man and said threateningly that he did not remember him feeding and raising him. The young man was in shock. He shouted that he was told that the commander had lost his memory, but he still asked if he had really forgotten all the happy moments of his life. He told the commander that he was too cruel because they had experienced many happy moments. The young lady in turn stood quietly and watched them intently. A moment later, she asked the young man if he wanted to have a normal conversation. Knox sighed heavily and slowly released the young man. A moment later, Gray beamed with joy and looked intently at the commander. A few seconds later, Knox hit the knight and knocked him out. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and said that the knight was injured. She didn't understand how he could just knock him out. He sighed heavily and said that she wanted to talk and he would disturb them. He said that she should explain to him what was happening now. Amy said that this man was a guest in their house and his name was Gray. She also told the young man that the knight knew him before he lost his memory. She smiled and said that the knight knew he was really like this and what kind of person he was, his real name. She smiled and asked if he wasn't interested in what his real name was. He sighed heavily and said indifferently that he was not interested at all. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. He looked at her intently and asked coldly if she really hoped to throw him out after his memories returned to him. She was taken aback and said that she had said no such thing. Knox said she meant that as soon as he remembered everything he would leave their house. He was furious and didn't understand why she didn't ask where he really wanted to be. She sighed heavily and looking away from the young man said that this was not what she meant. Knox approached the young lady with lightning speed and said that he was not going to go anywhere because he wanted to stay with her. Knox asked if he needed permission for that too. Amy was very confused by such pressure from the young man. She looked at her in bewilderment and asked what he would change if she allowed it. He sighed heavily and said that absolutely nothing. He smiled tenderly and reaching closer to her said that it would make him a little happier. She pulled away from the young man and asked him how he felt about talking to Gray, and she also said that what she wanted to say was not that he needed to leave. Knox looked at the young lady with cold fury and said that she seemed to call him by his name easily. He asked if she really liked the young man. She was taken aback because she didn't understand what he was saying. She smiled and said that she knew his name since he had introduced himself earlier. He sighed heavily and said that if that was the case, then he would talk to him. Unfortunately, the young people never got to talk as the knight had to leave their house the next day. The young man smiled and said that it was time for him to move on as he had already lost a lot of time. Amy looked at the knight intently and asked if he would like to meet Nose again at night. He smiled and said that everything was fine, and also asked if they hadn't met him yesterday. Gray said that he had already seen how his commander lived, and now he had to tell the other knights in the squad about it. The young lady knew that this was the case, but she still hoped that they would talk. He looked at the ladies with a smile and said that they were both benefactors to him who had saved His Highness the Duke. He smiled and asked if they would like to return with them to the duchy. They looked at him in surprise as they did not expect to hear such a thing. Diana thanked the young man with a smile for the offer, but they could not leave the place where they were now living. And frankly speaking, it was difficult for them to part with the child who had become part of their family. She smiled and said that they did everything for his good, and also asked the knight if he could give them a little time so that they could prepare for parting. He sighed heavily and said that he understood them, and also agreed with them. Gray said that his comrades were in the western part of the forest, and the road from the house to his comrades would take a long time, but nevertheless, even if not for long, he asked to take care of the young man. Diana smiled and said that many amazing events had been happening lately. She turned around and looked at her sister and said that it was time for them to go back. Amy in turn wondered if they could now live peacefully for some time, but she was still puzzled because for some reason she felt anxious. At the same time, the young man was rushing at full speed to his friends, as he was glad that he had finally managed to find his commander. He knew that he needed to return to camp as quickly as possible and tell his comrades everything. At the same time, the mercenaries were watching him closely, and from his facial expression they realized that he had found the Duke in the forest. They mocked the young man since he did not even know how to hide his emotions, and therefore caused a lot of trouble to his master. They also discussed an informant named Hans, as he told them to avoid a house that was in the forest, and he asked to ensure the safety of the girl who lived there, but the young men thought that this was just nonsense, and they wanted to immediately report to His Majesty and gather the entire detachment. They intended to kill everyone, including the Duke. Amy looked at her sister intently and asked if she wanted to just relax today. Diana smiled and said that because of the night she was unable to finish her business because yesterday she had not collected enough ingredients, so she needed to go a second time. She looked intently at the young people with a gentle smile on her face. She knew that the young man had lost his memory, and she understood that it would be better for him to return to his place because many people were waiting for his return. She smiled tenderly at the young man and said that he didn't know what had happened yesterday, and before she told him everything he needed to prepare himself mentally. Amy sighed heavily as she knew that the boy did not yet know that he would have to return with the knight to where he used to live. As she left, Diana smiled and said she would return early. The young lady smiled and told her sister to be careful. Diana smiled and said she would certainly do so. Knox looked intently after the young lady and said goodbye to the sleepyhead with embarrassment. Diana came closer to him with a joyful smile and asked if he had just waved to her. The boy flinched as he had not expected such pressure. She looked at him intently and with tears in her eyes asked him to do it to her one more time. For the last time, Amy told her sister that it was time for her to leave. Diana was puzzled and shouted that it was not the most important thing now, and also asked if maybe she should not leave at all. After a few seconds, Diana finally left. Amy turned around with a smile and, looking at the boy, said that a lot had happened lately. He looked at her closely and asked if the man had left. She looked at him in bewilderment, but a moment later said that the knight had left this morning and also asked the boy if it was time for them to return to the house. She looked at him in bewilderment as she saw that he had drooped, but a moment later, Knox turned around and ran away from the young lady with lightning speed. His action greatly surprised the young lady. Sometime later, they finally went into the house. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand why he behaved this way. A moment later, he turned around and handed her a small book. Opening a page of the book, he showed her one word and asked if it meant estate. She was surprised because she didn't understand what he was talking about, but still said that an estate was an incredibly expensive place and that aristocrats or people who had a lot of money lived there. She said with a smile that this was a place where neither she nor her sister could live. He sighed heavily. She asked him in bewilderment why he suddenly asked about this. She did not understand why he now looked as if he wanted to cry. He looked at her intently and asked if this place was his, if she would live with him there. She froze in shock and asked what he was talking about. Amy looked at the young man intently and asked if he remembered something without answering her question. He asked if she couldn't live with him. She was puzzled and wondered what she should do. She wanted to know if he remembered something. A moment later, the young man threw the book away and sighed heavily. He reached out to the young lady and asked if he remembered everything, they would not be able to live together. The young lady slowly knelt down and asked if he really wanted to live with her. Knox looked at her intently and nodded, saying that he wanted to live only with her. He looked at her with excitement and shouted that she should not go anywhere. It seemed to him that she would definitely leave him. She looked at him intently and calmly said that when he was older, he would have a loved one. Knox looked at her with bewilderment as he did not understand what she was talking about. Amy smiled and said that when he met the person he loved, his opinion would change. He sighed heavily and asked what would happen if he grew up and continued to love her. She smiled softly and said that in that case they would think about it later, but she also informed him that people quickly change their minds and change themselves quickly. He looked at her with a frown and said that he would not change. Amy looked at him with a smile and said that in that case they would wait until he turned 23, and if by that time he did not have a loved one, then he and Diana would live together. Knox looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and asked if it was true. She smiled and said that it was true, and if he wanted it, then so it would be. She knew that at 23 he would realize his feelings for the main character. Her love would become the key to magic that would lift the curse from the young man, and a happy ending would await them both. She knew that this was accurately described in the original, so she could not interfere with their happiness. In order to save her sister, she had already intervened in the course of events, but she knew that no more changes could be allowed. She knew that before this moment she had to leave. A moment later they were taken aback as they heard some kind of crash. She sighed heavily and asked the boy if he heard the rumble. Amy was worried because she did not understand where the sound was coming from. Looking out the window, she froze in place as she saw unfamiliar young people, but after a few seconds she saw red medallions on them. She was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot as she realized that this was the sign of the Crown Prince. She understood that the knights had definitely come to them because of the young Duke. A moment later, she grabbed the young man by the hand and shouted that he must follow her immediately. She shouted that he should go faster as they had to hide in the house. She told him that they had little time. A moment later, she saw the chest and said that if he opened it, there would be some space in there. She said that although it was cramped, this place would be perfect for him and he could hide. Knox was scared, but in turn he asked what about her. The young lady said in a hurry that Anna would check the back door. She understood that since they broke in from the main entrance, the back door was probably untouched. She knew that while the young man was hiding, she needed to quickly look around, but a moment later she pissed and fell to the ground with a crash as the knights opened the door and hit her. She froze in shock when she saw the knights looking at her menacingly. A moment later they said mockingly that they had found a young man. She froze in place with fear. A moment later the young man called his commander. The commander sighed heavily and said that it was easier than they thought. He looked at them intently as everything went like clockwork. The young lady froze in place with fear. She was puzzled because she did not know what to do. The man sighed heavily and asked his subordinates if this was really the girl the informant was talking about. The young men said they looked alike, and that was true. He looked closely at everyone else and asked about the situation in the forest. The young man said that there was a battle going on in the forest, but they were outnumbered, and the Duke's knightly detachment would not reach the house. Amy was puzzled. Their words made her burn with rage because she did not know what happened to her sister, because she was also in the forest. The young man asked the commander what they should do with the girl, since the informant asked not to touch her. The man looked at them mockingly and said that they should kill everyone. A moment later, the young men drew their swords and looked at them intently. Amy was in shock as the boy rushed into battle. She screamed for him to stop, but it was all in vain. Knox rushed at one knight with lightning speed. He looked at them with fury and shouted at them not to come closer. He was angry and shouted at them not to touch Amy. The man looked at the boy with mockery and contempt and said that he had guts. He looked at him with fury and drawing his sword said that he would kill him quickly. The young lady rushed to the boy's defense and begged them not to touch him. Bursting into tears, she closed her eyes and began to beg someone for help. But a moment later, the young people were taken aback as they saw a bright light. The seal on the young lady's hand worked, and with the help of magic, Diana turned the boy into a man. A moment later, the young man looked at her intently and said tenderly that he didn't know what was happening now, but she shouldn't cry. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to see him since she knew that it was daytime. He looked at her intently but said nothing. The young men were shocked by everything they saw. They shouted that the boy had turned into a grown man, but even if he was a duke, he was alone and they had no intention of retreating. Knox looked at everyone present in bewilderment as they called him Duke. As he left, he sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, that they would talk about this later." A moment later, he drew his sword from its sheath and told everyone to remain in their places. He looked angrily at everyone present and advised them not to move. The man was furious and shouted at his subordinates not to stand still but to attack the Duke immediately. With the speed of lightning, the young man rushed into battle. In turn, he easily dealt with his enemies, striking them blow after blow. The man was furious and shouted to his subordinates that the young man was protecting the girl and therefore they should immediately attack her, thus creating a crack in the defense. A moment later, Nox turned to the young lady and called her name. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he had stopped. He looked deep into her eyes and in a calm manner said that she should hug him tightly. She froze, but eventually came to her senses. A few minutes later, she did what he asked and threw herself into his arms. After this, the young man hugging the young lady dealt with his offenders. A few seconds later, the young lady saw a small bag near the house. She shouted to the young man to immediately cut the bags with his sword. He looked at her in bewilderment. She shouted what he should do, and then he would understand everything without any unnecessary questions. He did everything as she asked. She said that with the help of this herb, you can make a big explosion if you set it on fire. She shouted that they need to be stunned so that they can run away. A few seconds later, their former home was on fire. The man was burning with anger and fury and shouted to his subordinates that they must not let the Duke escape. Nox sighed heavily and asked the young lady where in the forest they could hide from the fire. She was puzzled because she did not know what to answer, but after a few seconds she came to her senses and said that they needed to find the chuck tree because it could not burn. He sighed heavily and asked if she knew which way it was. She said with sadness in her voice that they needed to go west. She hoped that her sister was safe. A moment later, they came to a tree. The young man asked the young lady if it was a tree. Nox called her anxiously, as he saw that she was agitated by something. After a few seconds, she came to her senses and said that they had come to that tree. Amy said that the peculiarity of that tree was the holes in the trunk. Nox was surprised because he saw that the hole was huge, and it seemed to him that someone had made it on purpose. Amy said that if you climb into the holes, you can see a very damp space, because the wood had accumulated enough moisture to prevent the possibility of fire. Nox looked at her closely and said that it would be safe there. It was worried she looked at him but did not answer. He looked at her intently and called out to her as he saw that she was very excited. Nox, looking at the young lady, said that her sister was fine because after all she was very strong. He looked at her intently and said that she should trust him. A moment later, the young lady could not bear it any longer and emotions overwhelmed her and she burst into tears in front of the young man. She knew that everything was right and that worrying would not change anything, but Amy still knew that she needed to think everything through carefully. Amy wondered if this was how her sister died. In the original, Amy knew that Diana was worried about her and Nox, and when she headed home, she was attacked by the Crown Prince's squad, losing the battle. She died at dawn in the garden of their home. Amy was puzzled and confused, not knowing what to do. Nox walked up to the young lady and called her tenderly. Nox looked at Amy intently and said that she should listen to him very carefully. Nox told her that she should hide well until he returned. Amy looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was in shock and asked him if he really wanted to leave alone. With tears in her eyes, she screamed that it was very dangerous there. But in turn, the young man said that this place was not far from the house, and if the tracks had not yet disappeared, he could quickly find Diana. She was shocked and screamed that they would never let him in because the night forest is a dangerous place for travelers, and if they hide in a tree, they can remain unnoticed. Amy looked at him intently and with all her might begged him not to leave. Nox moved closer to her and wiping away her tears told her that she didn't need to cry. She looked at him worriedly and told him not to change the subject. He said that they would soon be caught up and they had no time to chat. She was shocked and asked if that was why he wanted to distract the mercenaries. She was shocked and screamed that she could let him go alone. Amy was sure that he needed time to rest because he had been fighting all this time. She begged him to wait a little near the tree. He looked at her intently but said nothing. A moment later, Nox said that she seemed to care very much about her sister. The young lady looked at him in confusion but did not respond. But after a few seconds she sighed heavily and said that it was so because sister was as dear to her as her life. But in turn she knew that he was just as important to her. Nox looked at her closely and said that every day with every breath he thought about her. He said that he thought that these feelings were fleeting and therefore tried to get rid of them, but unfortunately he was never able to do so. So when he saw her tears, he couldn't bear it, and he just couldn't silently endure when she cried. He said that he didn't want to see her cry at all. He was always worried that as soon as he let go of her hand she would disappear, but he really wanted to protect her. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why. When she returned, she called him Rinok. He did not understand why, when she touched him, he transformed. Nox looked at her intently and asked if she could answer these questions. She froze, looking at the young man because she didn't know what to answer him. A moment later, she looked away from him, embarrassed, and said that if he returned unharmed, then she would answer his questions. She smiled and said that for this reason, he should return safe and sound. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as he came very close to her. She was shocked because she knew he wanted to kiss her, but knew he shouldn't. Nox looked at her intently and asked if he really needed permission to touch her lips. She looked at him confusedly and asked if he would get it and do it. He looked at her with a smirk and said that of course he would, because he wanted to try everything with her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she had promised that if he returned unharmed, she would not go anywhere, and then no matter what she said, he would not let her go for a moment. A moment later, Amy heard the sound of explosions finally die down. She saw that it was almost dawn, but she still wondered when Nox would return to her. She was very worried and hoped that nothing would happen, but she still assumed that he was in danger, just like her sister. She understood that she needed to get home as quickly as possible. The young lady, in turn, had no intention of sitting and waiting for the young man. A moment later, she ran towards the house. She stopped near a tree as she had nothing to breathe, but she knew that she still had a little time left. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock as she saw a young man covered in blood. She shuddered because she did not know who was in front of her, but a moment later, she noticed the emblem of the silver wolf. She understood that this was the sign of the Duke's nightly detachment. She approached the young man and asked if he could hear her. She wanted to know where the Duke was. The young man, with the last of his strength, said that the commander had entered into battle with them. She was puzzled because she understood that he was still in the forest. Amy looked at the young man and said that unfortunately, she didn't have any medicinal herbs with her, but she knew that first she needed to stop the bleeding. A moment later, she used her power. She was surprised because she saw the magical light again. She was surprised because she didn't know what it was, and she wondered if she could use the power and heal the wounds, but she knew that sometimes she couldn't do anything. The young man looked at her intently and, trembling with pain, asked who she was. Amy hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, she said that she would call for help. A few minutes later, she arrived at her house and froze in shock, as the sight was not for the faint of heart. She hit herself in the face several times because she wanted to wake up from the terrible nightmare. She turned around looking for her sister, but she didn't see her anywhere. But after a few minutes, she finally saw her sister, and she was not in very good condition. In a hurry, the young lady rushed to her sister as she was very worried about her. She screamed and called for her sister and wanted her to wake up, but in turn she noticed that her sister was badly injured and her breathing was getting weaker with each passing minute. She knew that she needed to quickly stop the bleeding. But a moment later, Gray approached the young lady and called her. She froze for a moment as she saw that he was with the Duke. She stood up in a hurry and asked the young knight what her commander was. The young man sighed heavily, and having seated the Duke next to him, said that he alone fought with the detachment of the Crown Prince. The prince's men were several times more numerous than theirs. He sighed heavily and said that it was the first time he had seen the commander so mad. Gray said with alarm that he was insane, especially at that moment when it was necessary to protect Diana, and the commander was ready to sacrifice his life for her. The young lady was stunned by what she heard, as she understood that he saved her sister with his life, and now he was in serious condition. Gray sighed heavily and said that everything was correct, but perhaps if the commander returned to the duchy and received treatment from the mages, he would get much better. She looked closely at the young man and asked if there was a way to return to the duchy. Gray said that to do this they needed to gather all their knights together, but since they could only use the power of the Knight Squad now, they should move to the nearest city or temporary shelter. He sighed heavily, and looking at the Duke with sadness in his voice, said that unfortunately he did not know whether he would survive magic in this state. Amy looked at the young man intently and asked if he would help her if she could save the Duke. Gray looked at her in surprise, as he didn't expect to hear it. He thought, but alas, it in turn said that he swears on the honor of a knight, if she can save the commander, he will do anything. A moment later, Knox opened his eyes and called out to the young lady. She was taken aback as she had not expected him to open his eyes. The young man slowly rose to his feet. Amy was in shock and screamed that he couldn't get up because the bleeding hadn't stopped yet. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had kept his promise. She was taken aback and froze in shock. But a moment later, the young lady burst into tears and said that she knew about it. She thanked him and said that for this reason she was going to treat him a little. Knox looked at her closely and said that what he needed now was not treatment. Amy looked at him hard and told him that he should stop and go back to his seat, for their meeting was a chance meeting. She said that he meant nothing to her and also asked if he realized that he looked at her hard and told her that it was a lie. But a moment later he put his arm around her and pulled her closer and also told her that she should say that it was a lie. The young lady froze for a moment, but he, without looking at her resistance, kissed her passionately. She called him, but she also called his real name. He quietly whispered to her that his name was Knox, not Rhinoc. Hugging the young lady, he asked her not to let him down and not to leave him. He said that he could not live without her. A moment later, a wave of magic enveloped them. A few minutes later, the young lady froze in surprise as she saw a small child in her arms. Gray looked at her with excitement and asked if this was really her ability. Amy sighed heavily and said that it was, but she didn't know why. But if he was with her, he could transform and his wounds would also heal. But after waking up in a child's body, he still had difficulty walking, as the pain in his wounds sometimes made itself felt. Gray looked at her in surprise and asked if she could really maintain his adult image. She said that she did not know the reason why he was becoming a child and could not control this process. She looked closely at the young man and said that he had previously told her that if she helped him, he would do anything. She asked if he would keep his promise. He looked at her in surprise for a moment, then said that of course he would keep his promise. She smiled and thanked him and asked if he could first move her sister to a safe place. He sighed heavily and agreed with her. Gray sighed heavily and told him, lady, that it was because of them that they were both dragged into all of this. He wanted her to accept his sincere apology. A moment later, the young man was taken aback and turned around as he heard someone calling him. The knights anxiously asked the deputy commander if he was okay. Gray stood up with lightning speed and told the young lady that these were his comrades from the knightly order. He asked the young lady to wait a little. She looked closely at the young people as she realized that they were people from the Order of the Dawn. She knew that they were all loyal to the Duke. A moment later, the second-in-command approached Amy and called her. Gray looked at the young lady intently and said that he had entrusted the care of the commander to his comrades, and now she could hand him over to him. Gray slowly handed the young master over to the knight and told him to take care of the commander. He looked closely at the young lady and said that in order to start treating her sister as soon as possible, they would use the transfer. He said that through physical contact, he could transfer up to 3 people. Gray looked closely at the young lady and with a gentle smile asked if she could take his hand. A moment later, the young lady took his hand and also took her sister's. A few seconds later, he said that he would begin the move. After the transfer, he looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Gray said that due to the teleportation, she might feel a little dizzy. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was okay, but he had to take care of her sister. Gray looked closely at young Julia Idy and said that he understood her and would also try to find a hospital as soon as possible. Sometime later, they finally found the hospital. The doctor examined the young lady and told her family that it was a miracle that she had survived, and if they had been a couple of minutes late, the situation would have been impossible to fix. The man said that because of the wound she had a fever, he would give her an antipyretic right away, but she needed to sit up at night and monitor her condition. The man looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. She sighed heavily and said that she was okay and not hurt. He said that was good news, and in that case, she should look after the patient, and if they needed anything, they could call him. The doctor looked closely at the knight and asked him to follow him for further treatment. Gray looked at the young lady intently and said that after the treatment he would return to his comrades and return to her immediately. He looked at her intently and said that just in case he would like to ask her not to go anywhere. She looked at him in surprise and asked how she could leave her sister and go away. Gray said that after her sister felt better, they could go to the duchy together because there was a good doctor and many wizards there, so she would be able to recover faster there. Gray said that they couldn't just leave their commander's saviors behind, and besides they were dragged into all of this because of them. Amy looked at the young man intently and thanked him with a smile. Gray told the young lady that the Imperial Knightly Order would continue to pursue them, and the damage from their attack would be significant, and if it became known that the young lady was the Duke's fiancée, the number of pursuits would increase, but he wanted to protect her. Amy, taken aback, looked at him and asked why he called her the Duke's bride. He looked away from her embarrassed and asked if she hadn't kissed the Duke. He smiled a predatory grin and said that of course it had been clear from the very beginning that he and the commander had an unusual relationship. She sighed heavily and said that they had only kissed once and she was already his fiancée. He looked at her in surprise and asked if the commander had stolen her kiss, and that was why she wanted to leave him. She knew that it was she who had stolen his kiss. As he left, the young man said that the commander was the kind of person who would never let go of something he wanted to get. A moment later, he told her that she should rest. The young lady looked at her sister closely and sighed heavily, wondering if she knew that this would happen. Some time ago, Diana looked at the young lady closely and said that if they were the Duke of Nox, they might be drawn into a showdown with the aristocracy as assistants in his escape. Then Diana handed her sister a small bead that could move her to any place, and Amy had to use the bead to escape. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew she needed to use the bead now. To be honest, she hoped they would have another year before the attack. She hoped he could forget her and become happy like in the original. A moment later, the young lady used the bead to move. She looked at her sister with a smile and said that it was time to leave him. Some time later, the young man entered the room, but it was empty. He was in shock as he knew they were gone. But when and how he could not know. A moment later, he saw a small note and a lock of hair of a young lady near the bed. Amy asked Gray to tell the Duke that she was dead as her wounds were fatal. A moment later, Knox burst into the room and asked where Amy was. Gray, in turn, was taken aback and froze for a moment, holding the young lady's note in his hands. The young Duke looked at the note intently, and a moment later he furiously told his assistant to find the young lady and not to let a single hair fall from her head. Burning with rage, he shouted for them to bring her this very second. After a while, Diana slowly opened her eyes and called her sister. Amy looked at her sister with a joyful smile. With the speed of lightning, she rushed towards her sister and hugged her sharply. Amy looked at her sister with concern and said that it had been several days already, but she had not woken up, and therefore she was very worried that she would not wake up again. Diana smiled and told her sister that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and she had grown a lot during that time. Amy smiled and thanked her sister for surviving. Diana smiled and said that she couldn't leave her sister alone. Diana looked closely at her sister and asked where they were since she knew that this was not their home. Amy informed her sister that it was her first time using the travel bead, so she was not exactly sure where they were now. Amy said that they needed a place where Diana could rest. And so she found the house, which had been empty for a long time. Diana thought for a moment and said that she understood everything. But if you think about it, she had been inflicted with many wounds, but there were no remains even if she did. Diana was shocked after hearing her sister's story. She asked her sister if she really cured her. She asked her sister if she really got this ability from the book she found in their house. The young lady sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. Diana looked closely at her sister and asked what was wrong with the boy. Amy shuddered because she did not know what to answer. Diana looked closely at her sister and said that the last time she saw her was only her. She asked if the boy had regained his lost memories, as she was very worried if he was okay. Amy looked at her sister intently and said that he was not Nox but Rhinoc, and that was his real name. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he remembered everything. Amy, sir, smiled sadly and said that due to the injuries he received, he lost consciousness, but since he was healed by magic, everything should be fine, and she said that now that he had found his true home, he should be happy. Diana sighed heavily and said that everything was true, and it would be good if it were so. She in turn very much hoped that he would smile often. Amy told her sister that Mr. Gray called them to the duchy, but she refused. She looked at her sister and asked if she had really heard her words about how she was not going to go to their duke. Amy sighed heavily and asked her sister if she was really a child. She said that their house was half burned down. She sighed heavily as she regretted it very much because their house was filled with their memories. Amy sighed heavily, and the story came to mind that the young man asked her not to leave. He very strongly asked her to stay with him. The young lady was puzzled as she had promised such a thing, yet she had run away. She knew that he could not live with them because he was a duke, and they could not follow him to the duchy. She sighed heavily and said that they would be much better off if they just separated. Diana looked closely at her sister and said that she thought that no matter what choice she made, she would always find a reason. Diana smiled, and wiping the tears from her sister's face, said that she should not cry. A moment later, Diana stood up slowly and said that they should check how safe it was here. She looked back and stared out the window. Diana sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the place given to her was not quite suitable for shelter, and she thought that they would be better off going north. The young lady looked at her sister in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Sometime later they set out on a journey. Amy told her sister with a smile that the food in the mountains was quite tasty. Diana told her sister that since it was her first time in the city, she should eat more, because if her endurance was better, they would be able to cover a long distance. Diana looked out into the street and told her sister that in towns like these, there were small post offices, and she needed to go to one of those offices so she would be back soon. Diana looked at her sister intently and said that since they had lived in the forest for a long time, she wanted to buy a newspaper because at the post office you can find out the latest news by buying a newspaper. Amy looked at her sister intently and said that she agreed with her, but she should come back soon. A moment later, the young lady looked up and froze for a moment as she saw a young man who was familiar to her. She was shocked because she realized that he was one of the knights of the Knightly Order of the Dawn. She was shocked because she did not understand why he was in such a place. Amy knew she needed to leave the establishment as quickly as possible, but a moment later, the young man heard a noise and turned around. He looked down in surprise and saw a young lady sitting on the ground. At the same time, Amy raised her eyes and looked at the young man in shock. She was puzzled because she didn't know what to do, but a moment later, a small thought came into her head, and she screamed and called everyone present for help. Everyone was in shock. They didn't understand what had happened. Amy, in turn, continued to scream and say that a scary man was trying to take her somewhere. The young man was in shock and screamed that this was not so. But at the same time, the young lady ran away without a trace. A moment later, she ran to her sister and shouted that they needed to escape quickly. Diana looked at her sister with worry and asked if she had done something wrong to the Duke. Amy was shocked and screamed that it was not so. Diana sighed heavily and asked her sister, "How about Togo talking to the young man about their breakup?" Amy looked at her sister excitedly and asked if the young man was really here. Diana sighed heavily and said that she didn't know for sure, but since his knights were nearby, it was possible that he came with them. Amy was shocked. She didn't understand how he managed to find such a place. Amy screamed at her sister that she could not talk to him under any circumstances because he kissed her. Diana turned around and, frozen in shock, asked her sister what she was talking about. The young lady said that he kissed her. Diana looked at her sister with fury and asked how he dared to kiss her sister. She was burning with anger and fury and called him all sorts of names. A moment later, they heard that the knights had managed to catch up with them. Amy froze for a moment when she heard the young master's voice. She glanced at him sideways as she realized he had caught her. She was shocked because she understood that most likely everything happened because she changed history. That look that he cast into the distance was always so sad. There was loneliness in his eyes, and this worried her greatly. She, like her sister, loved him very much, but in turn she sincerely wished him happiness, just like in the book. 3 years had passed since she left her boyfriend. She slowly walked out into the street and saw a whole mountain of letters. Amy was surprised because she didn't know who had already sent her letters in such piles. Diana wrote about her sister that she missed her very much and also informed her sister that she had successfully completed her internship and would soon be promoted to knight. Diana wrote that after she was appointed to the position she would receive leave, and since she would be of age in a month she wanted to come to her Amy, in turn, was very happy because she knew that her sister's dream had finally come true. Diana also wrote that there was a certain comrade who had received an appointment several months before her. He came from the village to which they had fled, and this time he would be passing through, so he promised to check how she was living there. The young lady was shocked because her sister was intimate with some man. It was surprising news for her. After she and the Duke parted, her distrust of strangers grew, and she wondered if he was a good man. The village they settled in after escaping was located in the north and was difficult to detect with magic, so all the residents were safe. A year ago, Diana finally decided to settle in the village and join the ranks of the knights. Diana told her sister that in the Empire one could become a knight without hiding one's past, but she was afraid to leave her sister alone, so she asked her sister if she wanted to go with her. Amy spoke with a smile about her sister so that she would not worry and go towards her dream. And after she could stand on one leg, she could easily take her to her place. Amy was surprised because only a year had passed and her sister had already completed her internship, since usually the internship took about 3 years. She assumed that her sister had benefited from the experience of fighting monsters. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and screamed as the girl pounced on her, hugging her and shouting that she had brought dried papyrus leaves. Amy sighed heavily and told her friend not to scare her. Lena smiled and said that this was her act of love. Amy understood that the girl was similar in character to her sister, just as energetic, because when they settled in this village, they began to help many people. Diana became very close friends with a young lady who was a doctor in the village. After some moments, Diana and Lena became very close. Lena looked closely at the young lady and asked if her shoulders hurt, because this time there were many casualties among the mercenaries and ginseng gatherers. Amy Yu, in turn, knew very well that, thanks to this, she did not have time to be sad, and she supposed that this was even for the best. Lena smiled and asked the young lady if the rumors were true. Amy looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Lena smiled and said that a punitive detachment would be sent from the palace to the mountain borders. She said that many had already spoken about both of these rumors, and it turned out that these rumors were true. She thought for a moment and said that, surprisingly, His Highness the Crown Prince was fair and cared about his people. Amy was surprised because she knew that the man was not interested in anything but himself. Lena looked at the girl intently and said that in a few days there would be a festival in the city. Amy asked her friend in surprise if there had always been a festival there. Lena smiled and said that she had heard that this festival would be in honor of a hero, namely Duke Rhinoc of Iberia. Amy choked on her tea when she heard this. Lena looked at her friend with concern and asked if she was okay. Amy sighed heavily and apologized because she choked, and she also asked her friend if she was talking about the festival. Lena smiled and said that everyone knows the story of the Duke and the sorceress Siren because she was a powerful sorceress and a beautiful girl, and now everyone in the Empire is busy preparing for the festival. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything. Lena looked closely at her friend and asked with a happy smile, "How about going to the city together and having some fun?" Amy said that she didn't like noisy places, and if a lot of visitors came, it would be impossible to squeeze through, and she herself somehow didn't want to go there. Lena smiled and told her friend that she should go to have some fun. She smiled and asked if Diana would come with her. The young lady, in turn, firmly said that she would not go anywhere. They argued among themselves for a while, but after a few minutes the young lady smiled and said that it was time for her to go as she had a lot to do. Lena sighed heavily and told her friend that she would come to visit her again tomorrow and she should think again about the festival. As she left, Lena said goodbye to her friend with a smile. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and lay down on the bed. She was very tired. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because the conversation unexpectedly turned to the Duke, and she was momentarily confused because of this. She did not even understand how the day went. She knew that the events of the original began several years ago and that there would be a festival soon. She knew that in the middle of the story the evil king would be beheaded and there would be a marriage announcement in the palace. She knew that it was just a national festival and that perhaps a wedding would take place soon. She sighed heavily because she knew that she didn't need to think about it much, and it would be better to go to bed quickly. She looked around in surprise as she heard a painfully familiar voice. She was shocked when she saw a young boy who told her with a gentle smile that he missed her. He sighed heavily and asked if they couldn't live together, as it was very difficult for him without her. She sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had to go. He sighed heavily and asked where she was going. Amy looked intently at the boy and said that she would go somewhere, but he couldn't go with her. With tears in his eyes, the boy asked if she really hated him. The young lady was taken aback and said that of course she didn't. Knox looked at her intently and, with tears in his eyes, said that it was very difficult for him to wait. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, she heard some kind of rumble and noise as someone called her and said that she should quickly come out. She, opening her eyes wide, froze in place from shock. Amy slowly sat up on the bed as she realized she had heard her friend's voice. Yawning, she got out of bed and slowly went downstairs. She was puzzled as she did not know what had happened at such a time. Lena smiled and told her friend that she had brought a very handsome guest. The young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment. She froze in surprise for a moment when the young man turned and looked at her intently. She was in shock and did not understand who was in front of her now because she saw that at first glance he was healthy without any fractures. Amy wondered if this was really her sister's friend, about whom she had written earlier. Amy looked at the young man and asked if it was possible that he knew her sister. The young man in turn hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She looked at him in surprise and asked what was the matter. She wanted to know if he really felt uncomfortable somewhere. Lena, in turn, was in shock. She shouted to her friend that her clothes were causing her a lot of discomfort. The young lady froze in shock as she looked at herself and realized what she was currently wearing in front of the guest. Some time later, the young lady came down to her guest having changed her clothes, but a dead silence reigned between them. Lena, in turn, looked at her friend with a joyful smile and said that she would leave them and also wished them a good time. The young lady was shocked because her friend brought the young man herself and then left. She was puzzled because she was very ashamed and she could not understand what was wrong with the atmosphere. She looked intently at the young man and asked if she was right in understanding that he was a close friend of her sister. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to tell her right away that his name was not Kaban. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he found her then. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was standing at the entrance to his village, and the girl who had just left them came up to him and asked if he was injured. He said that he confirmed her words, and she led him to her. Amy sighed heavily, knowing her friend was a real pain. She looked at him closely and said that earlier he had told her that he was not injured, but from his appearance she could not tell. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. A moment later, he showed his hand. She looked at him intently as she saw that he was poisoned. He smiled and said that it was all true. Amy looked closely at the young man as she saw that the poison had spread over his arm. She knew that the poison usually tormented the wounded in style and suspected that he was in great pain. She sighed heavily and said that, to begin with, since he had come, she would do the treatment. He looked at her in surprise and said that it was not necessary to treat it because it was an ordinary wound. But a moment later, the young lady slowly untied her hair and looked at him intently. He froze for a moment, blinded by her beauty. He always looked at her with a knowing look and asked if he could find out what she was going to do. Amy smiled a gentle smile and said that he did not need to worry, as she would not eat him. The young lady looked closely at her companion and said that she would need to draw blood, so she would blindfold him. She knew that even among mercenaries there were those who were afraid of the sight of blood. She did not know who he really was, so she wanted to hide the fact that she possessed supreme magic. She wanted to blindfold him so that he would not see anything. A moment later, she slowly ran the tape over his face and said that perhaps it would burn him a little. The young man in turn froze for a moment. Amy Funny blindfolded him with a ribbon. A few seconds later, she used magic on him. But she still decided to hide the fact that she used magic, so she pricked his hand with a small needle after using magic. After a few minutes, she smiled and said that it was over. The young man slowly removed the bandage from his eyes and was dumbfounded when he saw his hand, which was completely healed. He pulled away from her, shocked by her actions. She looked at him intently and asked if she understood correctly that he was a knight. He was taken aback and said that he was, but he asked her how she knew about it. She smiled and said that clothes like his were not worn by ordinary people. She smiled and said that since he did not have the emblem of a knightly order, he was either a retired knight or an aristocratic traveler in hiding. He smiled and said that he understood her. She smiled and said that she thought he would be more modest, and she also apologized for being rude, but he looked quite defiant. He sighed heavily and looked away from her, but later said that this often led to misunderstandings. He smiled tenderly at the young lady and said that he was not a dangerous man at all, and he would be glad if she stopped treating him with caution. He looked at her intently and said that he could tell the reason for his surprised appearance. With the speed of lightning, the young man approached the young lady and with a satisfied smile said that he was weak to such beautiful girls as her. Her face froze in surprise for a moment. Amy was shocked because she felt like she was seeing a completely different person in front of her. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the small seal and shouted that he had dropped something. With the speed of lightning, she suddenly stood up and said that she would pick up what he dropped. When she picked up the small seal, she froze in place as she knew it was the mark of the crown prince. He smiled and slowly walked closer to her, and also said that he had not intended to reveal himself at all, but it seemed that he would have to introduce himself even if it was late. The young lady turned around with lightning speed and froze in place in shock. The young man smiled and bowed, saying that he was the crown prince of this country, Tangshiz Lagnar. Amy was shocked and did not understand what the crown prince himself was doing here. She knew that in the original, he was described as a beauty with platinum hair. She was puzzled because she knew she should have recognized his face, but unfortunately she was too puzzled by the situation that she did not recognize him at all. She was furious because he had changed the color of his hair, she of course did not recognize him. The prince looked at her in bewilderment because he saw that she was worried about something. She was surprised, looked at him and asked what a man was, how he did it in such a place. The prince smiled and said that the city was currently talking only about the punitive detachment. He asked if she hadn't heard anything about it. She was taken aback and said that she had heard but thought it was empty tales. She asked the prince if such detachments didn't roam near the city. She was excited and did not understand how such a person, how he could go alone without protection. He smiled and said that he had arrived at an illegally settled village. He smiled and asked how he could take knights with him. He asked if people who lived in a village like this without the permission of the Imperial family would not be afraid of him. Amy asked in a frightened tone if he had come here to get rid of the village. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that to tell the truth he had some thoughts on the matter. But a moment later he came closer to her and asked with a smile how he could destroy the village in which his benefactress lived. He wanted to leave this matter alone, this time. He smiled and kissed her hand and said that he had told her earlier that beauty was his weakness. The young lady in turn looked away from the prince. She abruptly took her hand away and asked what he was suddenly talking about. The prince smiled and said that at first he just wanted to see the village of fugitives, which he had heard a lot about, but there was something much more interesting here. Tangshiz looked at the young lady with an admiring smile and said that he never thought that he could receive such treatment here. He thanked the young lady with a smile for her help. She was scared because she knew this shouldn't happen. The reason she hid in this village was for the Duke to become a happy man. She had to escape, but after going through all this, she was now connected with another protagonist. She knew that the prince hated the young Duke and really wanted to kill him. The young lady turned around slowly and told the prince that she had to go to the next patient. As she left, she turned around and asked the prince if he could please leave the room, and she timidly apologized. The prince was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing, but moments later he smiled and said goodbye to her. After a while, she sat down quietly on a chair and sighed heavily as she was puzzled by the prince's presence, but at the same time glad that he had left. She knew she needed to hide somewhere as quickly as possible, but there was only a small village near the mountains, and she could be found immediately. She knew she needed to get lost in the crowd. Sometime later, she decided to go to her friend Lena, looked at her friend with bewilderment, and asked, "What about the guest?" Amy said that the young man was healed and left. Lena looked at her friend in bewilderment and asked what kind of bag she had. Amy quickly shouted to her friend that she had previously said that she would like to go to the festival. She said that she had changed her mind and they could go to the festival. Lena looked at the young lady in surprise, but said that she was very glad to go with her and also asked when she wanted to leave. Amy hastily shouted that she would like to leave immediately today. A few days later, they finally arrived at the festival. Lena smiled and said that thanks to the festival, the atmosphere in the city was serious, but at the same time cheerful, and it was hard to even imagine what the city looked like in normal times. They walked around the city for a while, looking at all the entertainment. Lena looked at her friend in surprise and called her as she saw that she was very tired. Lena was worried about her friend's condition, but she still told her friend that she would feel better if they took a little walk. After a few minutes, she took her friend by the hand and pulled her to other entertainments. A moment later, Lena told her friend to look up as there was a monument to the hero Duke. Amy froze in shock for a moment when she saw the Duke's monument. She thought for a moment as she knew he had grown up lately. She asked her friend if this girl together with the Duke was the famous sorceress. Lena smiled and said that everything was correct, and even the sculpture was beautiful. Sometime later, the young lady looked into the distance as she heard people whispering. They said that the Duke and the sorceress loved each other very much. Amy knew it was true because, as per the original, the young people would soon fall in love with each other. Lena looked at her friend in surprise and asked what happened to her. Amy said that she was simply inspired by such a beautiful sculpture. Lena smiled and said that maybe they would be able to see the sorceress soon. She said that after defeating the king of the monsters, the hero and the sorceress would participate in a parade throughout the empire. Lena smiled at her friend and said that she thought that was why she decided to come to the city. Amy knew very well that after the victory over the King of Monsters, a love triangle began in the palace because the Duke proposed to the sorceress and afterward their engagement was announced. She thought that this festival was in honor of the engagement. She understood that if the Duke participated in the parade, then she should not be here. She knew that everyone was looking forward to tomorrow's parade. Lena looked closely at her friend and told her to hurry up. The young lady sighed heavily as yesterday you had been looking for her, and she was very tired. She looked around but did not find her friend. She understood that before the apparatus started, she needed to find her friend and tell her that she was leaving. A moment later, the young man grabbed her hand and asked with a smile if Lena was really the name of her companion. Amy was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that it seemed they had met again. She froze in shock as she did not expect to see him at all. The young lady looked at the prince in bewilderment and asked what he was doing there. He smiled and, hugging her quietly, said that if she called him by his title in the city center, it could create problems. She sighed and said that she seemed to be suffering from delusions of grandeur. Perhaps he was stalking her, which is why she was here. He smiled and said that this is exactly how it is. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise as she had not expected to hear something like this. He said with a smile that he could track the magic that remained on his body for about a day. He also said that there were things he wanted to know from her, so he had no choice but to find her. Amy looked at him with bewilderment and asked what he wanted to know. The prince smiled and said that he would like to talk to her about his hand. The prince said that it was actually no ordinary poison, and he got it from the supreme mage. The young lady was shocked by his words. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was interested in how she managed to extract what had proven to be an impossible task for professional magicians. He came closer to her and persistently asked if she could tell him this information. Amy was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Amy was taken aback when she asked the prince if he really needed to get so close to her to talk about this topic. She asked if he wanted to move away. He looked at her in surprise for a moment, and after she said she felt uncomfortable. Tanshi's was taken aback when he said that she was the first one who had said something like that to the crown prince. She smiled and asked if it was true. The young lady looked at him intently, as she knew that of course she was different from other people, because she never intended to cross paths with him again. She smiled and said that she would answer his question first. He looked at her in surprise as he had not expected her to agree so quickly. She smiled and said that he was indeed very handsome, although his character was a bit nasty. Tanshi's was taken aback and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, the young lady pointed to him in the other direction and said that it looked like a hero was coming, and the crown prince quickly turned around. He looked closely into the crowd but did not notice anyone. At the same time, the young lady hastily disappeared into the crowd. He looked around but did not notice her next to him. He realized that she had disappeared into the crowd. He looked into the distance with a smile because he realized that she was a truly interesting person. Sometime later, the young lady also ran to a god-forsaken street and sighed heavily. She understood that now he would not find her. She was puzzled because she knew that after such experiences she would definitely die. Amy glanced sharply at her bag, hoping nothing had fallen out. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to be feeling unwell. He looked at her with concern and asked if she was okay. She froze for a moment as she thought she had heard the young man's voice somewhere before. Gray walked closer to the young lady and was stunned when he saw Miss Amy standing in front of him. She sighed heavily and looked at him puzzled, still not understanding what he was doing here. She looked at him with a smile and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and also said that she was glad to meet him, but unfortunately it was time for her to go. She asked with a smile if he could step aside. He was shocked and told the young lady that she should go with him. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if there was really a person she urgently needed to meet. He shouted that he had an urgent conversation with her and that she should go with him immediately. The young lady understood that he would not leave her alone, and asking for forgiveness, she threw dust in his eyes. As Amy ran away, she told the young man that she was truly sorry. Gray grabbed her hand and shouted that she had to listen to him. He looked at her intently and said that he was truly sorry, but he would get his punishment later. She was shocked. With the speed of lightning, he threw her over his shoulder. Amy was shocked by his action and screamed that this was a kidnapping. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. He screamed that if he didn't do something like that, she wouldn't go with him of her own free will. She screamed that even if it wasn't so, he shouldn't do something like that to a living person. One screamed that she wasn't a sack of potatoes. He asked for forgiveness and said that he could swear to her on his knight's honor that he would not do anything strange, that he would marry her. So he asked if she could trust him for a while. The young lady in turn pushed him hard and agreed with him. She looked closely at the young man and asked if everything was okay with his eyes, because they were very red. He looked at her in surprise and alarm because he did not understand what was being discussed. He sighed heavily and looked away from her because, frankly, his voice stung, and it seemed to him that his vision was improving. She knew perfectly well that everything would be exactly like this. She screamed that this powder was close in composition to poison, so he needed to quickly wash his eyes. He was shocked because he did not expect this. A moment later, she asked him for forgiveness and began to hug him tightly. He was shocked because he didn't understand what she was doing. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that she was very sorry, but this powder also had a mental effect, and if he did not wash it off quickly, his eyes would stop seeing, so he should stop moving to avoid stress. He was shocked and shouted that she should wait. Amy asked him to tell the Duke that 3 years had already passed and they had spent less time together. She said that he should forget her and move on. A moment later, she dropped the boxes and ran off into the distance with lightning speed. The young man shouted at her, but it was all in vain. After some time, she came out to the square and looked closely at the small fireworks display. The young lady was puzzled, as she did not understand why she was suffering all this. She looked into the distance as she saw that the light was very bright. Unfortunately, she had been running all day, and now her legs were shaking with terror. She knew that many years had passed, but in order to continue hiding, she had to go to her sister. She understood that if she left right now, they would definitely meet. She was excited and at the same time puzzled because she knew that the apparatus was in full swing, and it was difficult for her to find the carriage. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as someone touched her. She turned around as if she wanted to see who had bumped into her. But after a few seconds, she froze in shock as she saw Knox standing in front of her. He looked at her intently and asked where she was going to go. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she enjoyed her freedom. Amy was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise. She called him by name. He dries up and asked if she still remembered his name. He said with a smirk that it was she who chose him for him, and he also said that she dumped him in cold blood. The young lady stood frozen in shock, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the young man lifted her up into the air. At the same time, the young man was hastily looking for his general. He was in shock and shouted at the general not to remain silent and to answer immediately. Knox, in turn, glanced sideways into the distance but said nothing. A moment later, he saw his subordinate and said that it was time for them to return. The young man looked at the general in surprise and asked where they were going. Knox looked closely at the young man and said that they were going to the general's estate. The young lady was in shock. She shouted at the young man that he would still have to take part in the parade. Knox looked at the young lady intently and said that it was all over, for he had achieved his goal. She was in shock, wondering if the parade was over. A moment later, they were sitting quietly in the carriage. The young lady looked closely at her companion as she saw that he was irritated, but unfortunately she could not utter a word. Sometime later, they rode in the carriage in silence. She was worried because she didn't know what to call him now. She met the young man completely by chance and unexpectedly, so she didn't know anything. Amy knew that he was no longer that Knox. She looked at him closely and said that she knew he had something to say to her, but he shouldn't act that way. Knox looked at her and said that she had grown a lot. She smiled and said that he had also changed a lot, and she in turn had also changed since 3 years had already passed since their last meeting. Knox said that she was still as thin as she had been before, and that she must not have eaten anything at all. She said that she had eaten a lot, and also informed him that when he let go of her hand, then they would talk. He looked at her intently and asked if he should ask her permission. She froze for a moment. Knox looked at her closely and asked if he had to ask her permission when he went to touch her. Amy was taken aback and looking away said that he hadn't asked her permission anyway when he touched her. He looked at her with a smile and said that it seemed like she remembered everything he said with a satisfied smile that, as he thought she had not forgotten anything that connected them. Amy sighed heavily because she realized that she was simply doomed, because she drowned in this tenderness like a complete fool. She realized now that she should have said that she didn't remember anything at all. A moment later, the young man approached the carriage and told the general that it was time for dinner, as they should have some food before leaving. He looked closely at the young man and said that he had previously given orders never to open the door without permission. The young man smiled and told the general that he himself had said that one cannot remain hungry. The young man explained and said that the vice captain told him to knock. The young lady in turn looked at the young men with bewilderment, not understanding why they were looking at her so intently. Sometime later, there was a commotion in the camp as everyone was talking only about the young lady. The commander sighed heavily and looking at everyone present told them to immediately shut up and return to their places. The young man sighed heavily as he did not know which of what he saw was food. He knew that the southern grass grew haphazardly. The young lady slowly approached the young man and asked if she could help him. The young man beamed with happiness and thanked the nth lady, saying that it was a great honor for him. She smiled and said that he did not need to talk about honor at all. Amy looked closely at the young man and asked if he had really been collecting any wild herbs to replace the spices. He looked at her with a smile and said that was exactly the case. Sometime later, she was hired. The lady pointed out to him the different herbs and told him which ones could be picked and which ones could not. She smiled and pointed out to him the safest herb. The young man in turn looked at her with joy and thanked her. A moment later, the young man left the company of the young lady. She looked intently into the distance and saw her friend Amy in turn, wondered what was on his mind now. She knew that when they were at the bullfight, he was very close to her, but now he kept his distance. She sighed heavily, knowing that it was luck after all. A moment later, the young man approached the young lady and presented her with a delicious dish. She smiled and thanked Runt. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was sure that he was Runta, since he could have been Landy Young, and said that no one had yet been able to distinguish between him and his brother. She smiled and said that they were twins, and although they looked the same, there were still some differences, and it was not so difficult to recognize them. He smiled and said that he now understood what the vice captain was talking about, because the general had many problems but they had an appropriate reason. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The young man smiled and said that he was talking about marriage now. He looked at her intently and said that he would get into trouble if he talked so much, so it was time for him to go. He wished the young lady bon appétit before leaving. Sometime later, the young lady ran away in a hurry through the forest. She had previously told the young man that he could collect the safest herb. Nose in turn knew there was no question of safety. Vetrova had a soporific effect. She knew that he most likely did not wake up because she added a large amount of grass, capable of knocking out a lion. She understood that she had to leave the camp immediately. She knew that it didn't mean she didn't want to see him. She always wanted to see him again, even if just for a few minutes. But she couldn't change the story anymore, which was getting more and more confused because of her. She knew that if this continued, he would never be able to get rid of the curse. She knew that he had to get rid of it. A moment later, the young lady paused for a moment as she saw someone's silhouette. A moment later, she froze in place as the young man looked at her intently and said that it was too late. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked why he was here just now. He looked at her with a smirk and asked if she really thought the knights didn't know about it. Amy froze in surprise. She didn't know what to answer him. He looked at her intently and said that he was interested in something. Knox came closer to her and asked if he did nothing and just waited like she told him to. Would she run away from him again? Amy stood frozen in place. She looked at him intently and asked him to listen to her. He smiled predatorily and said that he thought his invitation was strange. A moment later, she noticed that there was a bright glow under their feet. He smiled and said that he was inviting his savior again. Amy was in shock and screamed that she could not go with him. He smiled a predatory smile and said that he would listen to her complaints when he escorted his savior to the castle, and he also said that he would prefer never to hear such a thing again. With the speed of lightning, they were transported to his domain. The young man rushed to the general and said that it was a great honor for them to see him again. The young man looked at the general with alarm and asked if he was now into kidnapping children. Knox looked at the young man with bewilderment as he did not understand what he was talking about. The young man said that the young lady was not a prisoner of war, and until that moment he had not noticed the gentleman bringing guests to the estate. Knox said that it did not matter at all what the situation looked like, but the girl was already an adult, so it was not a kidnapping. The young lady was shocked and screamed that this was a kidnapping. She was furious because he suddenly used teleportation to bring her to the manor, and she couldn't call it anything other than kidnapping. The man looked at the young lady closely and asked her with smiles to calm down for a while. He was puzzled, yes, as he understood that if the young lady continued in the same spirit, he would have to hide the body in the garden. Knox sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady said that she was right, and this was a kidnapping. He looked deeply into her enchanting eyes and said that he knew he was wrong, but still asked her not to cry. Amy screamed that she was not crying at all, and his sudden appearance had shocked her. She screamed that if she had been scared, then only in that case would she have cried. He sighed heavily and said that that explained everything. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he would like to wipe away her tears. He asked timidly if he could touch her. She closed her eyes and began to shake with fear. The young lady took a timid step back and retreated from her companion. He sighed heavily and told her that she looked very tired. He asked if she wanted to rest for a while at the estate. She was puzzled because she knew that she would not be able to escape now. She looked closely at the young man and still agreed with him. The next morning, the maid slowly knocked on the door of the young lady's room and asked if she was awake. Amy woke up in fright in turn. She hoped that it was just a dream, but still she gave permission for the maid to enter. A moment later, the maids came into their room, and the girl said that she was a maid, and her name was Elena, and she had come to the young league's home to help her. Amy looked at them with bewilderment, but in turn said that she was very glad to meet them. Amy looked at the maid with a smile and thanked her for her help, saying that she could change her clothes herself. The young lady also asked where her luggage was. Elena told the lady that her luggage was in the next room, and she would take her there. After some time, they entered the next room, and the young lady froze for a moment in surprise. She looked around intently and asked if her clothes were really among the other things. Elena looked closely at the lady and said that she would sort out the clothes later, and she also asked the lady if she could tell her size. The young lady thanked the maid and said that it looked like she would have to do more work because of her. Elena said that the outfit still needed to be organized. She asked the other maids to put the clothes in their places according to sizes and colors. The young lady in turn looked closely at everyone present and, sighing heavily, said that there were many outfits in this room. She was surprised and did not understand why there were different sizes of one outfit. She wondered if they were really made for many people. Elena looked closely at the young lady and said that this outfit here is only for one person, and all this time she was waiting for her. She noticed that the young lady was interested in something and she could help with the answers. And Elena also apologized to the young lady if she irritated her. Amy looked at all the belongings in confusion and wondered if Elena had really said that everything belonged to one person. Amy asked the maid if they all belonged to Siren. The maid, surprised and perplexed, looked at the young lady and asked what she was talking about. Elena said about her mistress that she no longer needed to hide. The witch world was shaking because of the love story between the Grand Duke and the Grand Archmage. Elena was taken aback and said that she shouldn't have said that. The young lady looked at the maid intently. She knew that everything was fine, but still, she shouldn't have said this to a stranger. A moment later, the young lady looked at the maid and called her. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked if they were preparing for a wedding. The maid was taken aback as she did not expect the young lady to know about it. Amy smiled and said that she heard it from the night on the road. She asked if it was a big secret. She sighed heavily as she realized that her thoughts were true. She didn't hear yesterday, although the story had changed a little and the wedding preparations were taking place right now. She was in shock. She didn't understand why the young duke brought her to the estate. She knew that he hadn't seen her for a long time, and most likely that's why he was so touched by their meeting. The maid smiled and said that they were preparing for a wedding, and this was very different from preparing for an engagement, so they had started preparing a long time ago. The maid said that unfortunately they had not heard that everything had been decided finally because the answer had not been given by the Duke. The girl said that the general had told them that if he received consent, the wedding would take place that very minute, but unfortunately they did not yet know how the consent would be received. The young lady asked in surprise if everything was really that complicated. Rosanalina smiled and told the young lady that she was very grateful to her for living up to the general's expectations. A moment later, Elena called out to the maid, who was taken aback. Elena apologized to the young lady because they had not received guests for several years, so the child was a little worried. Amy smiled and told the young maid that she did not need to worry about such things. Elena smiled and said, "Madam," that she needed to have breakfast now, so she asked if she needed help choosing an outfit. Amy smiled and said that she would probably need their help since she was going to find her outfits a little later. A moment later, the young lady, having changed her clothes, was looking around the estate. Elena asked the young lady not to touch the decorations while she was in the house, including all the walls. The young lady in turn looked at her in bewilderment, but Elena asked her to pay attention to the decorations on the walls, because one could expect the appearance of uninvited guests. They placed protective stones on the walls of the mansion, in which the spirits of demons were sealed, and she could notice this since there were small bells on the walls. Elena told the young lady that for this reason she should only walk around the mansion accompanied by someone, and she also informed her that the house barrier would be stronger at night. She smiled and told the young lady that the general was already waiting for her. A moment later, the young lady entered the living room, and the young man's beef froze for a moment. Knox smiled and asked his companion how he had slept. She was surprised, and at the same time surprised because he was waiting for her. The young lady in turn timidly greeted the general. He looked at her in surprise and greeted her in return. The butler looked intently at the young lady and asked her to sit down at the table. She thanked him with a smile, but a moment later she froze as she saw that the utensils were only for her. She looked at the man in bewilderment and asked if the breakfast was only for her. The butler smiled and told the young lady that they were told to prepare everything only for her. He asked if she was unhappy with the preparations. The young lady was taken aback and said that this was not true at all. She looked at Knox in bewilderment and asked if he wasn't going to have breakfast. She didn't understand why he had come to the dining room then. He looked at her sadly and asked if she was uncomfortable in his presence. She froze in shock. She was ashamed of her question, but turning away from him, she said that it was not so. He sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that although she was uncomfortable, she had no other option. He knew that it was not safe for her to be alone, and the said guests could arrive at any moment. She was puzzled and at the same time shocked because she knew that he was dangerous for everyone. Amy sighed heavily and said that many of the palace's ill-wishers could have ended up in the estate, but their target would be the general rather than her, so he should take care of his own safety. He looked at her intently and said that even being there he could not protect her, and therefore it was his personal task. She looked at him in surprise, but did not answer. She remembered the maid saying that the general had said that if permission was given, the wedding would take place immediately. They didn't know when the general would get it, so the young maid thanked the young lady for agreeing to such a wait. She thought for a moment, and turned the maid's words over in her head. It wasn't that she didn't like it. She also wanted the young man's sincerity and care, but she knew that it was inappropriate now. He looked at her intently and asked if she wasn't going to eat. She sighed heavily and said that thanks to someone she had lost her appetite. Knox smiled and said that maybe he knew a way to get it back. She looked at him in confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, he leaned closer to her and asked with a smirk if he should undress. She was shocked because she didn't expect this. Knox asked if his naked body didn't attract her. She froze in place in shock, but at the same time the young servants were staring at her. She was shocked and screamed at him to stop saying such things, as everyone present might misunderstand him. He continued to insist that she touched him and did not allow him to get dressed. Amy was puzzled by everything that was said, since they simply did not have clothes at home, so he walked around naked. She knew that this was all because of his reincarnations, but everyone could understand his words wrongly. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted him to undress right there, since it could have a positive effect on her appetite. Amy was shocked and at the same time confused. She shouted to him that she had already eaten everything. Knox looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile. The butler looked closely at the young lady and asked if everything was to her liking. She smiled and said that it was very tasty, and now she would like to rest. He smiled and said that he would accompany her to her room. As the young lady rose, she asked him to take her to the room where she had left her clothes and not to the previous one. He looked at her intently and said that he would do as she wished. Knox looked at the butler in surprise and asked where they were going. The butler said that the young lady wished to go to the dressing room. He looked closely at the butler and said that he would take the young lady himself. The butler bowed and told the gentleman that he understood everything and also wished them a pleasant time. Amy looked at the butler closely, as she knew that everything was not as he had expected. She was a little confused, as she did not understand why he was smiling at them like that. A moment later she staggered. Knox looked at her in surprise, asked what was wrong. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine, and they could continue on their way. Walking down the long corridor, the young lady thought for a moment, because they had not walked together for a long time. She knew that a few years ago a young man followed her everywhere. She wondered how much he had grown. She reminded him how little he was then. She reached out to the young man, but a moment later he turned around and looked at her in surprise. Amy looked away from him and asked if he could just leave his important business to be with her. She said that he was wasting his time on some guest like her. Knox looked at her intently and said that he was not busy at all. He came closer to her and said that, moreover, she was not some kind of guest. Knox told the young lady that she was very important to him. Amy was a little surprised by his statements, but a moment later she screamed as she suddenly felt a pain in her stomach. He looked at her in surprise and asked her excitedly what was wrong with her. Amy told the young master that she had a pain in her stomach. She was shocked and did not understand where the pain suddenly came from, so she wondered if she had eaten something wrong for breakfast. A moment later, she smiled at the young man and said that she was fine. She looked at him closely and said that he was still the same as he had been several years ago. She knew that his gaze had not changed at all since that time. She looked at him closely and asked what about his night form. He smiled and asked if she missed him. She forced a smile and said that perhaps she did. He said that the boy appeared every month for 15 days. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it was not his time, so nothing would work, but he was still by her side. Knox said that he always missed her. Amy looked at him sheepishly and said that he was just longing for that time and that they spent it together and nothing more. Amy said that this was the reason for his feelings for her. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he picked her up in his arms and said that he would carry her to the room because she needed to rest a little first. She looked at him in surprise and asked if something was wrong. He asked if she really thought he could hurt her. The young lady was in shock and screamed that he should let her go immediately, as her stomach was hurting even more. Knox hastily said that she should be patient for a little while. She looked closely at the young man, as she thought it was most likely because they were very close to each other, but she saw that he looked even more attractive than before. Some time later, the young gentleman slowly entered my room and laid the young lady on a small sofa. He asked her to wait a little as he intended to find a doctor. She said that there was no need for this as she was no longer in pain. Amy screamed that she was fine and that he shouldn't worry, but it was all in vain as he left the room with lightning speed and went to find a doctor. She sighed heavily and wondered what the rush was for, but still the young lady was glad that she could be left alone with herself. She smiled because she needed to. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she felt no better, but she knew that she might not get another chance. After a few seconds, the young lady left the room. She knew that there was no one nearby, and this was a great chance for a little escape. She knew that she needed to get out as soon as possible. She was glad that the transition stone was always next to her. Even though she had nothing else with her, she knew that she would succeed. A moment later, she mentally said goodbye to their general and used magic. But after some of her actions, nothing happened. The lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do now, and what was the reason since she couldn't move. Amy shouted at the stone in a hurry because she knew that all hope lay in it. A moment later, the stone fell to the ground, but a few seconds later, it miraculously moved to the wall. She sighed heavily and, looking at the small stone, said to herself that she could not live without troubles. After a few seconds, she reached out to the stone. She understood that just a little more and she would pull him out. A moment later, she cried out in joy as she had succeeded. Amy breathed a sigh of relief as she was lucky and wanted to leave quickly now, but a moment later she was taken aback as she saw small flashes. She was puzzled because she did not understand what was happening at all, but a moment later the young lady screamed and fell to the ground, and a monster appeared in front of her. She was in shock and simply could not believe that there was a ghost in front of her. She did not know how he ended up in such a place, but a moment later she remembered what the maid had told her earlier, and frozen in shock she realized that she had touched the warding stone. She looked closely at the monster as she realized that he was terrible. A few seconds later the monster attacked the lady and she screamed in fear. A few minutes later the young lady was running away from the beast of this monster in a hurry. She understood that it could be heard throughout the area, but she did not understand why no one had come to her aid yet. As she ran away, she screamed as if she wanted someone to help her. But a moment later, she was taken aback and fell to the ground as she realized that there were several monsters. She was in shock and did not know what to do. But a few seconds later, she saw Elena in front of her. Elena was shocked as the young lady managed to activate the guard stone and summoned monsters. Elena apologized to the young lady and said that she would deal with them right away. Amy was shocked and shouted to the maids that they were very dangerous. Amy, in turn, closed her eyes as she was very afraid, but at the same time, the maid used her magic, and after a few seconds, a weapon for battle appeared in her hand. She glared at the monsters after swinging her sword a few times. She looked closely at the young lady and said that it was their fault that this happened, so she asked for forgiveness. She was in shock since she had a sword. A moment later, she saw the maid rush at the monsters. At the same time, the young lady shouted to Elena that the stone between his eyes was his weak spot and she should move there. A few seconds later, Knox approached them, and looking at his friend said that it seemed that she, as always, was well aware of such things. Amy was taken aback because she did not expect to see him. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that she had not called him by that name for a long time, but she herself had given it to him. Knox smiled and told his companion that she had nothing to fear. He looked at the monster with a fierce grin and said that he would be able to protect her. Within seconds, they had dealt with the demons. Elena turned around and asked the young men in surprise why they were there at such an hour. The young man said that he had been delayed in negotiations with the merchants. A moment later, the young man bowed and greeted the lady with a smile, and also informed her that he was the butler of the estate, and his name was Hathlot Dillon. She looked at him in surprise and greeted him and introduced herself. Hatlot said with a smile that he was aware of her name and that it was a great honor for him to meet her. Amy looked at the young people in surprise as they looked very similar to each other. Hatlot smiled and said that they were twins. He smiled and asked if they really looked that much alike. Amy smiled and said that they looked very much alike. He bowed and said that he was delayed by important matters, so he apologized for the late introduction. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and shouted that everything was fine. He did not need to worry about such things. He smiled and said that for convenience, she could call him Lot. The young lady in turn looked at him in surprise but did not answer. A moment later, she remembered that in the book he was one of the minor characters. Hatlot was a loyal servant and assistant to the young duke, but in turn he was categorically against the relationship between the duke and the young sorceress. He always told the sorceress that she was not at all the duke's equal. Amy understood that besides everything else, he played the role of mother-in-law in the novel. She knew that he could not be called a negative character because for the Duke, he was the main assistant on the way to the title of Grand Duke Hatlot. Kneeling before the young gentleman said that he would follow wherever and would protect his interests until his last breath. The young lady could say with complete certainty that the young man was simply obsessed with the young Duke. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she had managed to discern the true form of the estate immediately upon arrival. He knew that this did not happen often. Elena smiled a joyful smile and said that it was probably fate. She looked at everyone present in surprise, but did not answer. Knox looked closely at his companion and asked if she was okay. She said that she was okay now, but she was still shocked by those monsters. The young lady was shocked. She had the impression that she would never be able to escape from him. That same evening, the young man reported to the captain that the young lady had attempted to use the stepping stone. The young man said that the lady could not use magic within the walls of this estate because he controlled all magical activity here. Only a more powerful magician than he could overcome these restrictions. He looked at the Duke closely and said that for this reason there was no cause for concern. The Duke, looking at the young people, asked what the situation was with the royal family. Hatlot informed the Duke that it seemed the Crown Prince was absent and that he was presumably searching for something in the mountains. The Duke asked the young men to continue their observation, as they must always be on the alert. Hatlot looked closely at the gentleman and said with a smile that he understood him, so they would not take their eyes off the prince. He did not know what other dangers they had in store for them. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and told them to strengthen the outer security, and he also asked that the power of the guardstones inside the estate be reduced for now. The young people were shocked, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. They did not understand why he asked to weaken the protective magic. The Duke rose from his chair and told his subordinates to be silent and leave immediately. The man smiled and said that they would carry out any of his orders and take care of the barrier. As he left, the young man said that they would not allow the barrier's reliability to be compromised. The young man was shocked and asked if the Duke had lowered the defense for the safety of the young lady. Hatlot looked closely at his friend and said that if he had realized this right away, he should have told him about it. After all, he was very worried about this situation. Hatlot sighed heavily and said that he didn't know, but for some reason, his soul was not at peace. The young man looked at him in surprise as he did not understand what he was talking about. Hatlot smiled and said it didn't matter at all because he felt things were about to get interesting. A few days later, the young lady still did not give up trying to use her stone. She was in shock and did not understand why it did not work, because her sister was sure that it would work. Sometime later, the maid knocked on the young lady's door to my room and said that she had brought her tea. Rosalind asked the young lady how she liked the rooms. Since the Grand Duke had lived there until he was 7 years old, she asked the young lady if she wanted to look around. Amy was surprised because she did not expect to hear something like that. She thought the room was quite lived in, but for some reason there was little furniture in it. She saw a spacious and large mirror and wondered if Knox used it. She slowly walked up to the mirror and wondered if it had always been in this place. She knew that a mirror like this belonged near the dressing room. A moment later, the young lady reached for the mirror and screamed as she felt pain. She was shocked because she felt a gust of wind. A moment later, she was taken aback as she was shocked by what she saw. She did not understand where she was. She sat up and looked around, not knowing what was going on at all. A few seconds later, she flinched as she heard someone's familiar voice, but unfortunately, she didn't see anyone in front of her. A few minutes later, she returned to reality, and the maid called her. The maid looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked why she was looking around so confusedly. She asked her mistress if she was not feeling well. The young lady looked at the maid in bewilderment, but a moment later said that she suddenly found herself in a rubble garden. The maid looked at her mistress in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Amy looked at the maid and asked if this mirror had always been in the room. Rosalina looked closely at the young lady and said that yes, but there was always a mirror in the room. She asked the lady if something was wrong. Rosalina smiled and asked the young lady if she was tired of sitting in the room all the time. She said that on her way to the young lady she met the butler, and he said that it was a bit cold for a walk now, but she could give the lady a tour of the mansion if she wished. She smiled and said that the butler asked her to show the lady some rooms. She smiled and asked the lady if she would mind going there. The young lady in turn looked at the small mirror in confusion and said that she was ready to go right now. The maid smiled and said that in that case she would take her immediately. Amy looked at the maid and asked what room they were talking about. Rosalina said with a joyful smile that it was very special because only one person was allowed to go there. The young lady looked at the maid in bewilderment, still not understanding what she was talking about. Amy was surprised that the special place was the library. The maid said that it was the personal library of the Grand Duke. A moment later, the young lady froze in front of the large portrait. She looked at the portrait in surprise because she thought it was her friend. But a moment later, she realized that it was not him because the color of the eyes was different. It seemed to her that the painting was alive. The maid looked closely at the young mistress and said that she was very surprised when she did not find her nearby. She asked the young league what she was looking for. The young lady asked for forgiveness because she was looking at the painting. The maid looked at her in bewilderment because she did not understand what she was talking about. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was talking about a blank canvas. Amy asked if the canvas was blank. The maid said that it was completely white. Amy looked at the painting in surprise and wondered if she was the only one who could see it. She slowly touched the painting. The young maid was surprised as the painting appeared in front of them again. The maid asked the young lady in surprise if she had really used magic on the painting. Amy smiled and said that it was not so. She looked closely at the large painting and asked the maid who was depicted in it. The maid said that it was the first great duke. Amy understood that if the Grand Duke was in front of her, then he was the one responsible for her friend's curse. She no longer wanted to call him handsome. She asked the maid what kind of beast was next to him. The maid said that it was a penling wolf. The young lady was a little puzzled as it was the first time she heard about a wolf. The maid said that she would tell the head maid about everything and asked the young lady if she would like to repeat her actions in front of her. A moment later, she told the lady with a smile that there were many books in the library that she could study. She smiled and said that in fact there were many libraries in the castle, but since the Duke had returned he had begun to collect books, and this library had become his personal one. She told the young league with a smile that as soon as she chose a book for herself, she should call her because she would be waiting for her outside. A moment later, the young lady looked closely at all the books that were in the library. She slowly approached the books that described medicinal herbs. She was surprised that the Duke was interested in them. She looked at the small book in surprise, as she knew they had once read it together. The young lady froze in shock as she saw medicinal herbs in the fairy tale books in an ancient language. She was puzzled and surprised as they had read these books together. A moment later, the maid turned around in alarm as she heard some noise in the library. She went into the library and asked the young lady if she was okay. Amy smiled and said that she was fine, but she got a little carried away and made a noise. She apologized and said that she would clean everything up right away. The maid was shocked because she did not expect to hear anything like that. The young lady smiled and said that since she had scattered the books, she should collect them. The maid shouted at the mistress that she could not do this. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she needed to rest. A moment later, the lady froze in place as she saw a small flower outside the window. It seemed to her that she had seen it somewhere before. She was shocked because she remembered that the young Duke was poisoned with this flower several years ago. She was surprised because she did not understand how a flower from their forest could end up in the estate. Amy looked at Rosalind and, taken aback, asked if it was really a garden. Rosalind in turn said that it was not only a garden, but that they grew special herbs in it. Rosalind sat on the young lady and said that in the western garden they grow herbs that only grow in the midnight forest. The young lady froze in shock. She understood that these plants could only grow in the forest, and growing them outside the forest was incredibly difficult. She did not understand why someone had to put in so much effort. The maid said that the Duke was looking for a skilled gardener who was able to plant plants throughout the kingdom, and he also asked to create a semblance of a forest. The young lady was shocked because she did not understand why the Duke needed such a thing. The maid sighed heavily and said that he never told anyone about the reasons. She said that the Duke could often be found sleeping in the garden, and it seemed to them as if he was thinking about someone. The young lady sighed heavily and wondered why he still lived in the past. Sometime later, she sat quietly in her room and remembered the maid's words. Amy was puzzled because she didn't understand why he still opposed her decision. She understood that this was not good, because the festive feast was supposed to take place soon. In the original version of the novel, she did not attend the feast. The young lady was puzzled as the story was already too confusing. She could not confuse it further as she did not know what the curse would turn out to be if it continued like this. She knew she couldn't waste a single minute, and she needed to leave as quickly as possible. She wanted to go out at night when she wouldn't be under constant supervision. But in turn, the young lady was a little puzzled, as she knew that the bells were everywhere, and the chance of being caught was very high. Even if there was a way to avoid the bells using magic, it was still too dangerous to walk along the corridor. She stared at the window and wondered if she could climb down the fence. She smiled and wondered why she hadn't thought of this before. Amy came closer to the window and looked into the distance with a smile, because she knew that when everyone fell asleep, she would be able to climb down the rope tied from things. She understood that she would be able to climb down from the window. In turn, she sighed heavily, since she saw that it was very high. She understood that before her priest run would turn out to be successful, she would suffer quite a bit. She sighed heavily and wondered what she should do, since she was clearly aware of the fact that she needed to leave before the feast began. A moment later, she turned around and looked closely at the small mirror. She knew that the last time she touched it, she had entered the land of illusions. She was excited and wondered if it was magic. She wanted to know if she could escape with the help of the mirror. Amy was sure that it was an illusion, but she still decided to touch the mirror, and a moment later she was transported to a small town. She froze for a moment and looked into the distance in surprise, as she was amazed by the fact that she had ended up in Sorbonne. She looked at her hands in bewilderment as she saw that she was wearing a dark cloak. A few seconds later, she heard someone's voice. Amy turned around and froze in surprise as she saw the Crown Prince in person. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she was a peacemaker, since only they walk in huge squares, and today it was quite strange. The young lady in turn looked at the prince in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. She covered herself with the hood because she understood that he did not recognize her. She did not understand what to answer him. Tanshi's looked at her intently and asked why she didn't answer him. She came and asked him for a few minutes. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was time to wake up. She was puzzled because she didn't understand what was happening. He smiled and asked what she was looking for so feverishly. The prince looked at her intently and said that apparently all the peacekeepers here were very curious. A moment later, he changed the magic and they moved to another place. Amy was stunned by what she saw. After a few seconds, they moved to another place. Principal looked at her intently and invited her to sit down.